was waving me goodbye. With hurry home drops on her cheek, trickle from her eye. Marie is only 6 years old. Information, please. Help me get in touch with her in Memphis, Tennessee. On her cheek, trickle from her eye. Marie is only 6 years old. Information, please. Help me get in touch with her in Memphis, Tennessee.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen. And police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence. I pray that his family can find comfort in the memory of all he tried to do for the land he loved so well. I have just conveyed the sympathy of Ms. Johnson, myself, to his widow, Mrs. King. I know that every American of goodwill joins me in mourning the death of this outstanding leader and in praying for peace and understanding throughout this land. We can achieve nothing by lawlessness and divisiveness among the American people. It's only by joining together and only by working together can we continue to move toward equality and fulfillment for all of our people. I hope that all Americans tonight will search their hearts as they ponder this most tragic incident. I have canceled my plans for the evening. I am postponing my trip to Hawaii until tomorrow.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes. At a federal court hearing today, the city tried to make permanent an injunction against the march. Police Director Frank Holloman testified that he had inside information that the Ku Klux Klan planned a countermarch. In his words, "I fear for the safety of the citizens of Memphis. It could be worse than Watts or worse than Detroit." Attorneys for Dr. King countered with a 9-point plan which they contended would prevent more rioting. During the violence which took over Dr. King's march in Memphis just 1 week ago, 1 young Negro was killed, 62 persons were injured, and 276 arrested. Dr. King himself, when it began, was surrounded by a protecting human wall of followers, put into a car, and quickly taken from the scene. Dr. King had this to say last night about the situation in Memphis.
If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around.
There was shock in Harlem tonight when word of Dr. King's murder reached the nation's largest Negro community. Men, women, and children poured into the streets. They appeared dazed. Many were crying. A young Negro said, Dr. King didn't really have to go back to Memphis. Maybe he wanted to prove something. Well, maybe he did. Dr. King, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, a leading exponent of nonviolence, had often risked danger, and he often said he would be willing to die for his cause.
The only way we can really achieve freedom is to somehow conquer the fear of death. For if a man has not discovered something that he will die for, he isn't fit to live. Deep down in our nonviolent creed is the conviction that there are some things so dear, some things so precious, some things so eternally true that they're worth dying for. And if a man happens to be 36 years old, as I happen to be, and some great truth stands before the door of his life, some great opportunity to stand up for that which is right and that which is just, and he refuses to stand up because he wants to live a little longer, and he's afraid his home will get bombed, or he's afraid that he will lose his job, or he's afraid that he will get shot or beat down by state troopers. He may go on and live until he's 80, but he's just as dead as 36 as he would be at 80, and the cessation of breathing in his life is merely the belated announcement of an earlier death of the spirit. He died. A man dies when he refuses to stand up for that which is right. A man dies when he refuses to stand up for justice. A man dies when he refuses to take a stand for that which is true. So we're going to stand up right here amid horses. We're going to stand up right here in Alabama amid billy clubs. We're going to stand up right here in Alabama amid police dogs if they have them. We're going to stand up amid tear gas. We're going to stand up amid anything that they can muster up, letting the world know that we are determined to be free.
Dr. King won his first important civil rights victory in Alabama when he led the famed Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. His campaign led to integrated seating on city buses in the deep South City, and that, possibly more than any other feat, added new fuel to the surging civil rights movement in the 1950s and beyond. CBS News will present a special program on Dr. King at 11 o'clock Eastern Time tonight over many of these stations. And now for an on-the-scene story of what happened in Memphis tonight, here is Russ Hodge, the news director of WREC-TV.
Memphis is a confused and shocked city tonight. No one can believe what has happened. It's been just a little over an hour since Dr. Martin Luther King died from an assassin's bullet. For the first half hour, police were busy trying to track down the young white man who it is believed fired the fatal shot. However, the picture has changed. There have been scattered instances of looting in the predominantly Negro sections of the city, most of it in liquor stores. Crowds have been gathering on street corners, and police are trying to break them up. The National Guard units from West Tennessee have been called back in after being released just a day ago. Mayor Henry Loeb has declared a complete curfew in the city, and this has been backed up by Shelby County Sheriff William Morris. King was shot as he stood on the balcony in front of room 306 in the Lorraine Hotel. He was alone. His aides were in the room behind him. Dr. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital emergency room. He died at 7 o'clock Central Standard Time from a gunshot wound in the neck. Police recovered what is believed to be the murder weapon, a Browning rifle with a scope sight. Reverend Andrew Young, King's top lieutenant, was at the hospital awaiting word and described the shooting.
Well, we were at the Torch Motel, and we were getting ready to go to dinner at Reverend Kyle's house, and we were waiting for Dr. King to get ready. And as he came out of his room on the edge of the balcony, he was shot. And we thought a firecracker had gone on. Most of us were downstairs on the lower level. And we immediately ran up and saw that he'd been pretty badly wounded and sent for the ambulance and the police and everybody.
Where was he shot at?
He was shot.
We have just talked to two of the leaders in Memphis, Judge Ben Hooks, a criminal court judge, a Negro, and a Reverend. We've also talked to the Reverend James M. Lawson, who has been a leader in the sanitation strike here, and also a pastor of Centenary Methodist Church. They have asked for citizens of Memphis to remain calm, and we believe that their words will have some effect. This is Russ Hodge, WREC-TV in Memphis.
The other news of the day in a moment.
This is another fine mess you got us into.
What do you think got those Indians so upset?
Who wouldn't be upset? Telling all those poor Indians that all the gold they found was non-returnable. Quartz.
How do you like this fiendish plan? Putting those cold Budweisers so close. Hey, I can read the label on this one. Listen to this. This is the famous Budweiser beer. We know of no brand produced by any other brewer which costs so much to brew and age. Our exclusive Beechwood aging produces a taste, a smoothness, a drinkability that you'll find in no other beer at any price.
If we ever get out of this, why don't you become a radio announcer? I sure wish the cavalry would arrive.
Oh, what makes you think the cavalry's going to come and rescue us?
Rescuing us is purely accidental. Today is payday at the fort. And yonder lies Custer's last stand.
Budweiser, best reason in the world to drink beer.
Hanoi is charged that American planes today attacked the populated northwest corner of North Vietnam, an area far above the 20th parallel bomb line set by President Johnson. Communist broadcast said the planes dropped more than 50 bombs on Lai Chau province, just 30 miles south of Red China's border. U.S. officials said they had no knowledge of such an attack, but they ordered an investigation. The supposed target area is only 10 miles from the poorly defined Laotian border, and some military sources raise the possibility that the planes were American-built aircraft piloted by Laotians who strayed off course. North Vietnam so far does not appear to be making a major incident out of this alleged raid, and U.S. spokesman expressed confidence that it would not affect the efforts to arrange preliminary talks between Washington and Hanoi. President Johnson spent much of the day in New York City. His announced purpose was to attend formal installation ceremonies for the new Archbishop of New York, Terrence J. Cook, at St. Patrick's Cathedral. We get the story from CBS News White House correspondent Dan Rather.
The The president's entrance into the cathedral was greeted by applause, unusual at such church services. In a modernized and shortened version of the ancient ceremony, Archbishop Cook received the shepherd's crook, symbolic of his new office. In his address, the Archbishop praised the president's new peace initiative in Vietnam and prayed for its success.
Let us pray with all our hearts that God will inspire our president, who has so greatly honored us by being here this afternoon. In the last few days, we have all admired his heroic efforts in the hopeful search for peace in Vietnam. We ask God to bless his efforts with success.
The president's daughter, Lucy, a Catholic, was with him today. Mrs. John F. Kennedy was also there. But after the final blessing by Archbishop Cook and the end of the 2-hour ceremony, it was UN Ambassador Arthur Goldberg who held the president's attention as they walked out of the cathedral together. Goldberg wanted the president to visit the UN. Mr. Johnson wasn't sure he should go. Only after reboarding his helicopter in Central Park did the president change his mind. The presidential motorcade cranked up again. Mr. Johnson doubled back across town from Central Park and met UN Secretary General U Thant. The substance of their talks dealt not with Vietnam armistice prospects, but with Mr. Johnson's program for economic development of all Southeast Asia, including North Vietnam. Following a half-hour session with U Thant, the president returned to Washington.
South Vietnam's government put out a statement today saying it welcomes the moves toward U.S.-North Vietnamese talks. In reality, however, the Saigon regime is concerned over possible negotiations, as we learned from CBS News correspondent Bernard Cow.
The North Vietnamese surprise declaration and the quick Johnson follow-up produced instant insomnia here. Lots of people remained awake during the night listening for more details on their radios, either from Hanoi or Washington. And while there has been an outbreak of jubilation mixed with caution that hopefully the diplomats might eventually get around to talking about peace, there was also the recognition that the moment of truth was approaching for Washington and Saigon, specifically whether the two allies will accept the same kind of compromise, whatever form it might take. South Vietnamese officials are concerned that domestic and political pressures on Washington may produce what's being described here as a sellout to the communists. And even President Johnson's reassurances that the United States will never accept a fake solution have not reassured everyone. Leaders of the South Vietnamese Senate and Assembly called a last-minute news conference this morning to reiterate the independence of South Vietnam, saying that they would never accept any imposed solution and that they still think that Hanoi's response was a gimmick and less than satisfactory. Earlier, U.S. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker met with President Nguyen Van Thieu at Independence Palace. The American ambassador left the palace after an early morning session, presumably assigned the same mission, to reassure the Saigon regime that their objectives were the same, peace, but not at any price. And later in the morning, President Thieu called a meeting of his own at Independence Palace. He summoned the ambassadors of the contributing allies to hear his views on the latest developments. It's being said by informed sources here that the Saigon regime will probably be more hard-nosed than the United States in trying to find a settlement. But it's also being said that whatever differences do exist between the two allies are horizontal rather than vertical. In any case, the war has suddenly been upstaged by the excitement of the possibility of meaningful negotiations. Bernard Kalb, CBS News, Saigon.
In New Zealand, a meeting of the 7 allies fighting in Vietnam ended with a declaration that they will keep on fighting until Hanoi agrees to respect, quote, South Vietnam's democratic and constitutional rights. The allies also rejected the idea of any Saigon government coalition with the communists. That solid front statement came after the allied ministers recovered from the news of the latest Vietnam peace developments. CBS News diplomatic correspondent Marvin Kalb has that story in Wellington, New Zealand.
Experts have been made fools overnight. None really believed that the North Vietnamese would agree to preliminary talks. The new judgment among this embarrassed group is that the North Vietnamese are gambling on getting a better diplomatic deal from a lame duck president than they figure they would get from a hard, tough campaigning Lyndon Johnson. Within this context, the key factor that apparently unhinged Hanoi in this key decision was the president's decision not to run, announced last Sunday. Every one of America's allies was stunned by the news, some apparently more than others.
So I know nothing very clear, so I cannot make any comment.
Do you think this is perhaps a step forward?
Frankly, as I know, I have no details about this press cable. I cannot comment on this news.
Did this kind of an idea that the North Vietnamese might agree to talk come as any kind of surprise to your delegation?
No, not at all. Not at all.
You yourself, Mr. Prime Minister, read this as a step forward towards the kind of negotiations that the Allies have been trying to get?
No, any kind of talks are better than no talks.
And this is, how would you describe this? These are preliminary talks that have been agreed to.
I said the position was unclear, but it appears at this moment that North Vietnam is maintaining the position which it has held for some time. However, they are prepared to talk, and this in itself is some progress.
The initial talks between Hanoi and Washington are expected to take place in secret, with Ambassadors Harriman and Thompson joining in only later. Moscow is expected to be the key site.
North Vietnam's Premier Pham Van Dong is quoted in a Paris newspaper interview as saying that Hanoi will be as serious in negotiations with the United States as, in his words, we are on the battlefield. But Dong also said there can be no real settlement unless the United States accepts the communist conditions for peace. Among those demands, already rejected by Washington, are withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Vietnam and recognition of the Viet Cong as the South Vietnamese people's only legitimate spokesman.
Just get me those figures.
Uh-oh. Here comes acid indigestion. Excess acid starts dripping into your stomach. You need new Triactin, the antacid with a special stomach-relaxing ingredient. Triactin not only neutralizes acid, Triactin's special ingredient goes further to help turn off the excess acid faucet. Excess acid's gone, indigestion's gone. New Triactin helps turn off the excess acid faucet, liquid and tablets.
In Vietnam, Allied relief forces were reported today to have advanced to within a half mile of the Marine outpost at Khe Sanh. At bad weather, an enemy mortar fire slowed up the drive at that point. At Khe Sanh itself, a Marine unit moved out and took control of a hill that had been held by the North Vietnamese. The Allies have yet to make major contact with the enemy, which was thought to have had up to 16,000 troops surrounding Khe Sanh at one time. Associated Press quoted Soviet sources in London as saying the communists lifted their siege of the base as a goodwill gesture connected with the expected preliminary talks between Hanoi and Washington. But American field commanders argue that U.S. airstrikes forced the communists to pull back from Khe Sanh. As the drive moved on toward Khe Sanh, CBS News correspondent Bert Quint was at the Marine post and filed this report.
Many of Khe Sanh's defenders have an idea that help is on the way. But there's no feeling of jubilation here, not yet at least. Nor is there any fear about what could happen between now and the time that help finally does arrive. Right now, there is an unaccustomed air of ease about this long-besieged outpost. Things have been relatively quiet for the last few days. Enemy rockets, mortars, and artillery, as well as sniper fire, still come in from the hills surrounding Khe Sanh, but there hasn't been as much of it. The men have been able to work on improving their trench living quarters, to relax a little, throwing a football around in the ruins of mortared buildings.
See? Simple as that. Look out for the 100.
Betting extraordinary sums that nobody intends to pay on the toss of a knife. Even on the perimeter, where South Vietnamese troops man the trenches between the Americans and the North Vietnamese, there is only sporadic firing during the day. At night, though, as it so often does, it gets worse. Whether they will be relieved or just reinforced here is not yet clear. But Marine Colonel David Long, Quezon's commanding officer is nonchalant about it all. What is it going to mean to you specifically, having that road open? Strategically, what will this do?
Well, I don't know specifically that it's going to make a lot of difference to me. Fortunately, the people above me and all of the armed forces of the United States have seen fit to keep me well supplied. Now, the manner in which they did it, as you well know, was by aircraft, since that road was not open. Now, it may make it easier on the people in the rear. I don't know that it... I've got what I need. Now, what it's doing to the people back there, I don't know. You'd have to talk to them.
Hi, Platt.
Hello.
How about a cup of coffee before the faculty meeting?
Oh, Jim, I have some papers to mark. I'll see you there.
Hey, Jim. What's with that? I don't know. I dated her once. Couldn't make the grade. I don't follow. The way she acts, you'd think I had bad breath. Come on, Teach. You got some learning to do. Try Listerine. Mouthwash is too sweet. Sweet as soda pop. Not Listerine antiseptic. It has a clean, fresh taste. Besides, Listerine kills germs. Germs? Germs can cause bad breath. Yeah, but a date can last for hours. That's just it. Listerine keeps breath fresh for hours. Okay, Coach. I'll try it.
94!
Hey, Jim. Hey. A special teachers meeting? Very special. You did it, Coach. Me? Well, maybe Listerine.
Listerine antiseptic kills germs, keeps breath fresh for hours.
Vice President Humphrey hinted today that he will become a presidential candidate, but at the same time indicated he probably won't declare this until after President Johnson returns from Hawaii, probably early next week. Delegates at a labor convention in Pittsburgh shouted, "Tell us what we want to hear, Hubert." But Humphrey replied that our decision will come in due time. The House today passed a weakened version of President Johnson's travel tax bill to reduce the dollar drain. The measure, which goes to the Senate, would impose a 5% tax on overseas airline fares. It also would cut the $100 duty-free exemption on foreign goods to $10. The second unmanned test of America's giant Saturn V ran into a series of problems today, which raised doubts about whether it is ready for astronauts to ride. The 36-story rocket and its Apollo spaceship lifted off from Cape Kennedy exactly on time at 7 a.m., but the failure of two of the Saturn's 5 second-stage engines put the big ship into the wrong orbit. And later, a third-stage rocket engine designed to start the spacecraft toward the moon failed to ignite for a test. Even though the Apollo landed safely near its Pacific target zone, the troubles threatened to delay the Man on the Moon program. It was nothing like yesterday, but the encouraging Vietnam news again pushed prices higher on the New York Stock Exchange. The volume was heavy, with more than 14,300,000 shares traded. The exchange index gained 22 cents. The murder of Dr. Martin Luther King has triggered violence tonight in Memphis's Negro section, and there are reports of trouble also in some other cities. Memphis police said snipers have fired on police and National Guardsmen, and that some persons have been hit. Fire bombings and vandalism also were reported. Birmingham, Alabama police also reported some disorders in a Negro section there, and Miami police were pelted by rocks when they answered a report that a furniture store was being looted. That in Miami. And that's the way it is, Thursday, April 4th, 1968. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, reporting from Washington. Good night.
We never expected twins. My wife was frantic at first. I tried to help, like doing the marketing. "That isn't the instant I buy," she said. "Try it," I said. "It's instant Maxwell House coffee. Good to the last drop. The instant that tastes like coffee." You be a good little Maxwell housewife and relax a little, and this marriage might even survive twins.
Maxwell House Coffee, instant and ground. Almost nothing has been done about tonight's dessert. Oh. Because Jell-O has invented a way to make a great cream pie by doing almost nothing. It has a crumb crust you don't bake.
No baking.
A filling you don't cook.
No cooking.
A topping you pile high.
That makes it
a great cream pie by doing almost nothing. New Jell-O cream pie.
Great.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. One man's way is paved with drama, controversy, and inspiration. Don Murray stars in the compelling story of Norman Vincent Peale on tonight's Thursday night movie on CBS.
Program originally scheduled for this time will not be seen tonight in order that we may bring you an hour-long special report on the assassination of Martin Luther King. Here in New York is ABC commentator Bob Young.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years old and a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and the leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement in the United States, was assassinated in Memphis tonight. A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he stood on a hotel balcony in Memphis. Within an hour, Dr. King was dead. That happened at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The nation was shocked. President Johnson expressed horror and then postponed his trip to Hawaii until tomorrow. We're going to go to Memphis now and talk to ABC's Tom Gerald, who is on the scene.
Here in Memphis, of course, a great deal of shock, a great deal of confusion, and a great deal of some violence. I can't say a great deal because I don't really know. I do know that police are very concerned, that the fire department is moving units around the streets, and that there is some rock throwing and some fires reported and some shooting. The full extent of at this time from this vantage point can't be assessed. The full curfew has been imposed on the streets of Memphis. Everyone except emergency vehicles are being cleared from the streets. The National Guard, which had been on duty here up until late last night, they have been recalled to duty and are being put on the streets of Memphis right away. Of course, a great deal of confusion and chaos resulting from the announcement here that Dr. King had died. It was a very great shock for something like this to happen. The shooting occurred at the Lorraine Motel. It was a favorite place for shooting occurred tonight, where Dr. King was killed. The Lorraine Motel is a favorite place for Negro leaders to stay while in Memphis. It's a very nice new modern motel. He was on the second floor balcony, standing exactly where these two officers are, talking with some of his aides at the time of the shooting. The scene immediately became confused. Officers ran forward and attempted to secure the area. The shot apparently came from an apartment building directly across the street. The members of Dr. King's staff were there discussing a mass rally which was planned for tonight. They said that suddenly there was a sound that sounded faintly like a firecracker or something, and he was talking about
then he was
the
shot.
musical program for tonight's mass rally.
Yeah.
And he had asked you to play a special tune.
Yes, yeah.
Did he say anything after he was shot? Could you tell how seriously he was wounded?
He just said, "Oh," and it knocked him back, off his feet.
After that, was anything said at all?
Nothing but "oh," and we yelled, and Reverend Jackson, he yelled back to Dr. King. We all hollered. Everybody hollered after the shooting, I was standing kind of sideways. I really didn't have my back to where the shot came from. And when I turned all the way around, we saw the sheriff or the police up on the hill up there.
That was the musical director for Dr. King's group, Ben Branch. He was standing alongside Dr. King when the shot came that killed Dr. King. In fact, Dr. King was discussing tonight's musical program with Ben Branch at the very moment when the shot was fired. The shot, as I say, apparently came from an apartment building which had a number of floors and overlooked the motel. It was a very clear shot to the place where Dr. King was standing on the balcony discussing the situation with his aides. The police here in Memphis immediately issued a bulletin for a young white man dressed in dark clothes who dashed out of that building across the street. He dropped a Browning automatic rifle, which was fitted with a scope, on the sidewalk, and then he fled. We don't have any late information from police headquarters here in Memphis. because communications channels at the moment are completely clogged with emergency calls. We don't know if anyone has been apprehended, although we understand that some suspects may be being questioned at police headquarters. So the situation here in Memphis is that a complete shock. The community is in a state of confusion at the moment. Telephone lines, except for emergency calls, are not being handled. Emergency calls only are being handled. And the curfew, which has been reimposed as a full curfew, everyone off the streets except emergency vehicles. And the National Guard has been called back out in an effort to maintain law and order. This is Tom Jarrell in Memphis. Now back to Bob Young in New York.
Thank you, Tom. Joining me here in New York is Peter Jennings, who's been on the road around the country, has seen some of the civil rights happenings, and has met Dr. King, and as I have. Peter, do you have any immediate thoughts about what this assassination, what the reactions may be around the country to it? I know this is highly speculative, but it's...
Yeah, I suppose the first concern, Bob, that everybody has, and it's obviously the one that Governor Buford Ellington has, and the people of Memphis have, and the people of Harlem have, and other major Negro areas in the cities around the country, is the outbreak of violence. I was sitting with a friend of mine tonight who's been very involved in thinking and believing in civil rights, and asked what his reaction was, and would there be violence? And he said no, he didn't think so, that King had created such a spirit, that this would not create a mass kind of violence like Malcolm X did. You know?
I think it bodes some waiting. Unfortunately, in New York's Harlem, it's raining tonight. Weather has a great deal to do with violence, as I'm sure that both you and I know, both in this country as indeed it does in some of the Latin countries, where we have both served.
Yeah, Bob knows, there's a great radio station in New York here, WBAI are the call letters, I think, which is essentially a Harlem-oriented radio station. And on past occasions when things have got, touchy in that particular area, WBAI has done a great deal to keep the community knit together and calm down. I was trying to get them on the radio tonight and find out if they were keeping things cool.
We'll talk a little bit more about that. The reaction to Dr. King's death prophetic words from Dr. Martin Luther King, and he said that less than 24 hours before his assassination. There is a sign of great sadness in New York's Harlem, and perhaps some horror as well, as the news spread through the huge Negro community here of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Men and women standing in the streets with bowed heads, listening to these reports blaring from storefront radios all along 125th Street. Many persons in the streets are crying, others moving listlessly and appearing stunned by the death of Dr. King. Said one 19-year-old girl he really didn't have to go back down there. Maybe he wanted to prove something. Henry Moon, who is spokesman for the National Association of Colored People, the NAACP, said that he was distressed, dismayed at the news. The most poignant words in a major tragedy often come from the simplest people. Dr. King's driver was on the street outside the balcony when murder struck. The driver said Dr. King strolled onto the balcony and told him to start the car, that Dr. King wanted to go to dinner. The driver tells it this way: I said, "It's cold outside, Dr. King. Put your top coat on." Dr. King said, "Okay, I will." He smiled. Those were his last words. "I heard the gun," he said. There will be a special program on ABC this evening, 10:30 Eastern Time. Wanted to alert you to that. And we shall, of course, be back periodically with updated information on the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. This is Bob Young in New York.
Tell us what you felt when you heard about the news of Martin Luther King.
Well, when I heard about the news of Martin Luther King, I felt real sad because he was the only man I know, colored Negro, that really led us into where we at now.
What's the feeling among the people that you know and the youngsters that you talk to? What's the feeling in Harlem?
Well, it's a feeling of partly sadness and mostly hatred because, they didn't really want him to die like he died. They want, to die, they didn't want him to die like he died.
You say hatred. Yeah. What is the hatred aimed at?
At mostly the white people.
Why?
Because it was a white man that shot Martin Luther King.
What do you think about the situation in Harlem now, the feeling in Harlem?
I think the feeling is to get back at people from Martin Luther King's death and things. That's why.
Do you think that's the right approach to take? Martin Luther King was a man who believed in peace and nonviolence.
I know Martin Luther King believed in peace and nonviolence, but everybody not like him. They trying to get their revenge and things on Martin Luther King's death.
Ed, you're 13 years old. What went through your mind when you heard the news?
Well, what went through my mind was that other day when it was what happened now, and I don't know exactly what happened, and he had to leave, and he came back to try to clear it up, and he wound up getting shot. What came to my mind? I feel sorry that he got shot.
Ken, you work among the youth of Harlem, and you know Harlem. What do you think the feeling is here today?
Well, I think it's out to destroy. I can't blame
in anything or do any good. Martin Luther King was a man of peace.
Yes, but I think it'll finally wake up the establishment, Mayor Lindsay, LBJ, and wake them up and see that the black man is not going to stand for this much longer. They're ready to really what was known down here come out their bag. They've had it. They've been oppressed for 300 years, and it's time for you to get some laws passed around here or just destroy everything that we built up in the 300 years.
What was your feeling, Ken, when you heard the news last night?
Well, I was walking down 125th Street. I was with a few Harlem Corps members and other civil rights workers, and we were all trying to tell the people to go home, but to no avail. It was hopeless. They chants like Martin Luther King is dead. It was too late. This is it. This is the spark that they needed, and I think if it doesn't accomplish anything, America will just live in its own ashes. Luther King was about the greatest leader our people has ever had, and there'll be no one who can replace him. He was the only one who believed in accomplishing what he really wanted through peace, where the rest are just militant. The feeling through Harlem now is just to destroy whatever belongs to the white man, and that's all. It's just destroy, 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 and I don't know where it's going to end.
Jeanette, what do you think is the feeling of Harlem at this moment?
Well, I'm just really shocked about what happened because I was shocked, very shocked, and I thought it was really senseless because it was the same thing when President Kennedy got assassinated. All the people, not only the Negroes, but I think everybody really feels it all over the nation, and I really don't think that it was necessary because now, in my opinion, it's going to provoke more violence. I think all this rioting and so forth is really nonsense. But I was really shocked about Martin Luther King. He wanted this nonviolence and so forth. But the people more or less just going out rebelling against it because it was a real big blow, in my opinion, to the entire nation.
Frank, what was your feeling?
I feel sad over when I hear that he got killed.
What went through your mind?
I felt sad. I didn't want him to die like that because he was leader of the civil rights, and I thought he'd do things right.
What do you think the mood of Harlem is? The people you talk to?
The most I talked was they said it called it was hateful over white people, hate them, all that.
Do you think it's the hate against all white people? Do you think that's a fair attitude?
Not against all of them, some of them.
Thanks, Frank.
This man who killed him had been watching him for some time here, and he knew that this was his room and that he would come out of it. That's what it seems to be.
Well, obviously he knew this was a room. He hadn't been in and out much because we've been coming in and out. Because Dr. King had been in here and he had private meetings with some of us about personal problems, and he had meetings with certain department heads about departmental problems, and you know, we'd had our executive staff meeting in here, and we'd had our what you call our action committee meeting where we'd meet with about Washington and Poor People Campaign, and we had the Memphis meeting. He had met with various local leaders. He hadn't been out that door since he checked in over 2 or 3 times.
Why did he walk out the time he was shot and killed?
We had been invited over to a local minister's house for soul food dinner. And
you were just leaving for dinner?
Just leaving for dinner. And he usually walk out a door. He's usually dressed and he usually go because he's usually always in a hurry. But he walked out there and held over, and the fellow who's been driving us around since we've been in Memphis told him, "Doc, you better get your coat." He said, "Okay," and he stood up there a minute or two, and I guess just it's a thing of destiny. I guess making, he just was a target there for
police think it was just one of those things that occurred.
Well, it's very difficult to place such an accusation. I don't know what you call police security. All I know is that police were all around. To that extent, it was very similar to the Kennedy incident, and that police were everywhere. But as I so often say, as I challenge people not to go around in some superficial bodyguard set up, assuming one can protect himself, in a society as sick as ours, with so much pathology, so much neurosis, and so much racism. There is no military protection against ambush and sabotage, and obviously he was ambushed. So the fact that the police were standing there and not standing on him means that they could not, to that extent, protect him. Now, the extent to which, with faith, just say outright that it was lack of police protection.
Was he here on this porch?
Go because he had sent for me to go to dinner, and I told him I was ready to go, and I was about to make another statement. I said, "Dr. King." Just as I said, "Dr. King," he straightened up, and when he straightened up, the bullet lifted him off of the ground, and of course, and as it took off a part of his jaw, he bled profusely before the ambulance came, and there were police all around. They came charging toward us, asking us what happened, from which direction did the shot come. All say over our heads, because you did not hear a shot, you just saw the explosion in his face.
What do you think might happen now in Memphis that he has been shot? Are you afraid that the situation here might explode?
Well, obviously, the love that people have for Dr. King around this nation and this world will create a deep emotional response. We had planned to have a mass meeting tonight at which probably 10,000 people were going to attend anyhow, and probably tens of thousands of others will attend now. We have decided not to call the mass meeting off because not having a radio station of our own and not being able to communicate with our people, it would only frustrate them. So we're going to have a mass meeting to discuss what has happened to him, to discuss how we shall react to it, and obviously to operate in his best interest as he would have operated. And of course, he would have operated by going on with our programs, which we feel to be in the best interest of poor people around this nation and this world. We shall keep our attention, in spite of the heavy tension, on the garbage workers, the fact that they cannot get a union contract and cannot get a dues check off. I do not know to what extent it will affect the Monday March, but I know that black people in Memphis are going to continue to march because we are going to get the strikers' collective bargaining agreement. So we're in somewhat of a real state of shock and tension, but there are two things. One, we shall attempt to keep the people in some perspective, and two, our programs will continue.
Oh, I'm a member of the strategy committee. I was with Dr. King at the time.
Oh, you are a member of the SCLC?
No.
You're local.
Yes.
What is your comment about what's happened here tonight?
And
we are trying to get, we're going to have a mass meeting tonight. There was some discussion about canceling the mass meeting. We do want to have the mass meeting.
The cars here come and go on Ridgewood Avenue in Ridgewood, New Jersey. It's not a big town, nor is it a very small town, the size of many American towns. 2 days after the death of Martin Luther King, we came here to find out just how people felt and where they thought the country might go from here. This is the residential district. Middle class, fairly well-to-do. That middle class that Martin Luther King felt was to be a stumbling block to the real progress of civil rights in America. The people who live out here shop down there also on Ridgewood Avenue. We talked to some of them. Can you tell me what effect Martin Luther King's death has had on you?
It hasn't had any on me personally. I don't know. I think that the way everything is turning out, that they're bending over backwards to idolize him, and I think that he was a very fine man.
Has it affected your decision? Hang on a sec, sweetheart. Has it affected your feelings about Negroes in general?
Well, I always have had a good feeling about them. So, I mean, I don't know whether I speak, for myself personally. I really don't feel any way prejudiced or anything about them. I think perhaps his death may have been, it may work in the reverse, and that people will treat him as a martyr, and maybe bend over backwards to, make everything better for the Negro.
Would you work towards that end?
Oh, certainly, of course. I'm all for it. I think that perhaps this is a horrible way to make people realize that they have to stand up and make this a good country, really,
And I'm wondering if you would comment for me on what you think the effect of Martin Luther King's death has been.
Well, I think it'll bring around a lot of people to realize that it's best not to be violent.
What do you think of the violence since his death?
I was in Washington the last 4 days as it happens, and I was disturbed by the situation down there. It's terrible. The violence going on right down there now, just contrary to what he stood for.
How do you feel about Negroes?
Well, I think they've got to be given a little better break than they have been given.
Would you work to that end now?
Yes, I always have.
More so than you have in the past?
I travel on the road. I meet a lot of them. I do business with some of them. And I think we've got to realize that they've got to be given a little better break in this country.
Thank you. Madam, what are you going to tell your children about Martin Luther King's death and Negroes in the future?
Well, that he was died for a good cause. I will tell my children that I believe that everybody should have the same freedom that the white people do. Negro and white should have the same freedom.
Do you feel now that you should do something more about civil rights than maybe you've done in the past?
Yes, I do. I really haven't done anything.
Do you intend to now?
Well, I'll tell you, it's very difficult. I have 4 small ones. My husband travels. But, I will teach my children this. And that if there's anything, if I do have spare time and I could do something, I certainly would.
How do you react to the violence that has followed Dr. King's death in the ghettos?
I think it's terrible. I don't think people should do this. This isn't what he fought for or died for.
Do you think if you were in one of those ghettos, you might do the same?
I don't think I would, really, because I feel that I am a good Christian, and that even being poor, living in bad surroundings, I don't feel that I would react this way. Because if I did believe in Dr. King, I wouldn't do this.
Are you ashamed this happened in America?
Yes, I am. I'm very ashamed.
Tell me what your thoughts are now, a couple of days after Martin Luther King's death.
Well, I'm shocked and horrified like everybody else, and I only hope that his death will be of some benefit to the interracial situation. I think a lot of people are reacting the wrong way about it with violence, and that'll never do any good, so let's hope that they'll see the light and feel differently about it.
What do you think Congress should do now?
Well, I think they've got to take a very different attitude, particularly the southern senators and representatives, and get going on really opening up the situation for the colored people.
What is your
equal opportunities?
What is your profession, sir?
I'm a lawyer.
Any difference between Negroes and whites in America?
Well, there certainly has been, but there shouldn't be. The colored people that have benefited from education and have shown that they have the spirit to be real Americans, no reason at all why they should be discriminated against.
What do you think the biggest stumbling block is to the Negro cause?
Oh, this fanatical attitude of a lot of them that they're being oppressed and they have to go out and be violent and react violently and steal and rob to show their feelings about it. That's hurting them more than anything, I believe.
Do you think it's better to maintain law and order in this country or to have justice here?
We have to have both. Justice is absolutely essential, but law and order is necessary too. They're not antipathetic terms. They should go together.
And what has been your reaction over the last couple of days since Martin Luther King was murdered?
Well, no comment. I haven't got nothing to say about that.
No comment on his death whatsoever?
No.
No feelings about it?
Well, I feel sorry that things like this have happened, naturally, and it's just one of those things that has to be corrected, and it's the wrong time being corrected. That's the trouble.
What do you think could be done to correct it now?
Well, I think they're on the right path anyhow. I think they're doing a lot of talking about it and preaching and whatnot. I think that'll conclude the whole situation.
Has your general reaction to Negroes changed at all?
No, it never has. I do business with some of these people.
You ashamed this happened in America?
I am, yes. It's a disgrace, I think.
What's wrong with America, then?
Nothing's wrong with America. I'm 100% American.
Well, why does it happen here?
I wouldn't know. They've got too many of the foreign element coming in here. I think it's wrecking our country.
What do you mean by the foreign element?
Well, they're coming from all over the world, and it makes it rough for the average American person.
Are you what, second, third generation American?
No, I'm a second, yeah.
Where'd your parents come from?
Germany. My father came from Germany when he was a very young man.
And you think anything unusual about the rioting that's occurred since Martin Luther King's death?
No, I wouldn't say that, no.
Doesn't upset you?
Well, everybody's upset about this whole situation. What can they do about it?
Well, what would you do about it now?
Well, I wouldn't know what to do. I mean, the way it's going is out of hand completely right now. When I have to bring out the militia, why, it's pretty rough.
Should black Americans and white Americans be the same?
Well, I think we should all unite, and it's one thing we have to do to keep peace today.
Parsippany.
Where?
Parsippany.
Parsippany. What's your reaction been to Dr. Martin Luther King's death in the couple of days since?
Well, I think it's a tragic thing. I don't think it should have happened, but we'll just have to go on without it.
If you were living in one of those ghettos, do you think you might have rioted as a result of it?
No, I don't think so.
What's your reaction to the riot?
As far as I'm concerned, there always have been.
Thank you. What do you think may happen now in America as a result of Dr. King's death?
I think a lot of people will be made more aware of the crisis that we're in.
Do you think he died in vain, or did it accomplish something?
Definitely not. Never in vain. That there really is no difference. I don't have any prejudice at all.
Thank you. What was the reaction in your family over the last couple of days to Martin Luther King's death?
Oh, I think we were shocked. I think we compared it in our minds to the assassination of Kennedy. And I think that everyone is shocked that such a terrible thing could happen in this country.
How old are your children?
7.5, 5.5.
And what have you told them about Negroes?
What have I told them? That they are citizens of the United States who have not been given their chance. And I told them to always treat colored people with respect. I've heard them use expressions like niggers and stuff like that, words like that they didn't hear at home, and I tried to correct them anytime I've heard them.
What do you think is going to happen in America now?
I know what I'd like to see happen. I don't know whether it will happen or not, that something like this possibly could pull people together to make them more aware of the colored people, that, what they have been lacking through the years in the field, particularly of education, I think.
What has your reaction been over the last couple of days to Martin Luther King's death?
A very sad story.
What do you think is going to happen now?
I think the people are going to get together and first realize how important it is to have love.
What are you going to do to that end?
The same as I've done before.
Which was?
To keep a happy relationship between people.
What do you think of Negroes?
As good as any white man.
Are they equal in this country?
Equal in the manner of... let me put it this way. Equal in the manner of wanting to be good citizens. But they are not being treated right in many ways.
Why does this kind of thing happen in America?
Hi there.
personally.
Hang on one second. Scram. Why does this kind of thing happen in America, do you think?
Our way of living is so big. The youngsters want so much, and it's not giving an equal chance to the colored boy, where he could go to school, get the same feeling of wanting to have the advantages the average boy does have.
Is the violence in some of the Negro ghettos justified then?
No. No.
Thank you.
Ricky's almost 3 and Michael is just 9.
And what have you taught them up until now about Negroes?
Not to be prejudiced.
What's your
There's
reaction?
no difference between color of skin is all.
Where do you think America's going to go now after the death of Martin Luther King?
I don't know. It's frightening, really. I hope we go the right way and not the wrong way.
Do you think you now have to do something about this personally?
Yes, but what, I'm not sure.
Have you any solutions in your own mind to what may happen in the future?
No, I sure don't. I wished we all did, but I don't.
Do you think that everybody could do something?
Yes?
Are you ashamed this happened in America?
Yes, I'm ashamed it happened in America. I've lived overseas, and people aren't real proud of we Americans overseas, and to have something like this happen doesn't make us look any better in the eyes of the other people.
Thank you.
Well, naturally, it's one of regret and sorrow.
Where do you think the civil rights cause goes from here?
I hope it goes forward.
Have you ever worked for civil rights?
No.
Do you feel a need to now?
Well, to the extent that I sympathize with them and so forth, but not actively, no.
What about the resultant rioting and rebellion in the ghettos? Does that upset you?
Yes, tremendously.
In what regard particularly?
Well, I don't think it's doing civil rights any good.
What do you think of Negroes generally?
Of which?
Negroes generally.
I don't think any different of them than anybody else.
Do you think they have full equality in this country?
Not complete. Not complete. In certain sections they do.
How would you say, sir, that Negroes could get full equality in America?
I don't know, except that they might continue to press for it.
After about 4 years of reporting civil rights in America, perhaps this is the time to make only one observation. Nobody in America ever admits to prejudice when they're on camera. This is Peter Jennings in Ridgewood, New Jersey.
We almost lost in our generation somebody like a father. In our lifetimes, people 25 and 26, he's the first major man we ever saw who started a bus ride and everything like that. And today, many people are out here on the street wondering which way they're going to turn because we don't know where we're going to go. Do we go to the right? Do we go to the left? We're not sure today. And we're out here trying to make up our minds. And we've lost something, and we feel it deeply. We feel it. We really do.
Tragedy. That America solves its problems by shooting. You name in the past few years, Kennedy, Malcolm X, Evers. It's going to have to sit down and talk anyway, just like in Vietnam. And that's the way to solve the problem.
We no longer have with us Martin Luther King, my closest friend and dearest associate, but we do have with us his very charming and beautiful and loving wife, who has come this evening to join with me in saying to this nation and saying to this world that even though you may have been able to stop the heartbeat of Martin Luther King, but you certainly will never be able to stop the surge for freedom, dignity, and equality here in this country.
My husband faced the possibility of death without bitterness or hatred. He knew that this was a sick society, totally infested with racism and violence, that questioned his integrity, maligned his motives, and distorted his views, which would ultimately lead to his death. and he struggled with every ounce of his energy to save that society from itself. He never hated. He never despaired of well-doing, and he encouraged us to do likewise. And so he prepared us constantly for the tragedy.
James Earl Ray, on his 41st birthday, admitted in a Memphis courtroom here that he killed Martin Luther King. His admission was part of an agreement between him and the state of Tennessee to avoid a possible death sentence. By pleading guilty, he was to receive a 99-year jail term, and so he pleaded guilty, but not without keeping alive the theory of a conspiracy. After famed Texas trial lawyer Percy Foreman entered the plea of guilty for his client, Ray immediately went on trial before a 12-man jury, which agreed in advance to convict him and sentence him to 99 years. Both Foreman and the prosecutors told the jurors there was nothing to the theory that Ray was part of a conspiracy. But to the surprise of the jammed, heavily guarded courtroom, Ray came to his feet, announcing he did not agree with the theories of a non-conspiracy. He challenged earlier statements by then Attorney General Ramsey Clark and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover that there was no conspiracy. Judge Preston Battle quickly asked Ray if he were trying to change his guilty plea. "No, sir. No, sir," said Ray, and he sat down and spoke no more about conspiracies. Then, as Ray looked on, the state presented a handful of witnesses, and less than 2 hours after the sudden trial started, Ray had been convicted and sentenced. Ray's attorney had said he never expected to be able to do anything other than save Ray's life. But there was the question of a conspiracy. About a conspiracy. The court himself announced that there was... the Attorney General had said there was no evidence of a conspiracy. I don't care. I'm not trying the Warren Commission report like Garrison did. I'm just trying on that. I don't give a continental damn whether there was a conspiracy.
Well, Mr. Foreman, did you ever ask your client whether he was a part of a conspiracy, whether he'd been hired?
No, I never asked him that, but I asked him enough other questions to convince me that he was not.
It has been established that the prosecution at this time is not in possession of enough evidence to indict anyone as a co-conspirator in this case. Of course, this is not conclusive evidence that there was no conspiracy. It merely means that as of this time, there is not sufficient evidence available to make out a case of probable cause.
No possible motive for Ray killing King was established at the Swift trial, but at a news conference, Shelby County Attorney General Phil Canale alluded to one.
Well, we've got our own theories about motive, and I'll just put it succinctly as I can that I think race had a lot to do with it.
Ray was expected to be spirited away under heavy guard today to the state prison in Nashville, 200 miles away, where a special isolated cell awaits him. Ed Rabel, CBS News, Memphis.
James Earl Ray wants a new trial. How do you feel about that?
I think James Earl Ray deserves a new trial. I think that if he hadn't been so crooked, so caught up with money, he'd have had a just trial in the first place. I'm convinced that it was a conspiracy to kill Dr. King. More people than one was involved. I think there were outside persons involved. I think a lot of money was involved. The FBI at some level, directly or indirectly, was involved itself. The FBI issued under Hoover's direction 2 very significant pieces of memoranda. One said August 25th, 1967, stop the black movement, discredit, disrupt, destroy, or otherwise divert. Then it came March 4th, 1968, 1 month before Dr. King was assassinated, to say prevent the rise of a black messiah, one who could electrify black crowds, mobilize, or otherwise solidify the black community. Certainly Dr. King could do that, and 1 month later he was assassinated. I think that just as in the case of Watergate, all of the records need to be exposed, all of the testimony needs to be heard. We're going to find some strange faces washing out of that mess.
The murder of Martin Luther King Jr. is a case that refuses to be closed. 9 years later, a special committee of Congress is investigating the crime. The Attorney General of the United States has publicly said he wants to talk to the man who sits in prison as the assassin. It was on April 4th, 1968, that Dr. King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee. In June, James Earl Ray was arrested in England for the crime. What we subsequently heard about Ray was that he was an escaped convict who had been on a strange year-long odyssey winding up in Memphis. What we heard from Ray was that his travels had been directed and financed by an underworld character he knew only as Raoul. It seemed a simple case when James Earl Ray pleaded guilty, but just 3 days later, he recanted, claiming that he'd been railroaded into the plea by his own attorney, Percy Foreman. For 8 years, the courts have refused to grant him a new trial. For 8 years, the questions about a possible conspiracy have persisted, and all this time, Ray has declined to tell his side of the story on television, until I went to interview Ray last week at Brushy Mountain Penitentiary in Tennessee, where he is serving a 99-year sentence as the assassin of Martin Luther King, Jr.
Did you fire the shot that killed Dr. Martin Luther King?
No, and I think now, based on investigations of those who have represented me, that we could prove it through some type of judicial proceedings.
6:01 p.m. Immediately after Dr. King was shot, people with him pointed toward a rooming house across the street. Ray had rented a room there that day. The state claims he fired the fatal shot from there. Ray says he has an alibi.
Now, this, of course, is critical.
Yes.
As your recollection as to where you were between, let us say, 5:50 p.m. and just after 6 o'clock, April 4th, 1968. You remember going to the service station,
yes,
having the tire fixed?
I didn't have it fixed. They said that something, it was busy. It was a business hour or something. They didn't have time for it. And I never did get the tire fixed.
My point is that you were not in the rooming house, or were you, between, let's say, after 5:30 p.m.?
No, I'm positive I wasn't in there after 5:30.
Well, let me take you back to that day in the courtroom when you had your day in court. Short day it was. The judge asked you whether you were doing it voluntarily, the guilty plea, and you said yes, sir. I can't understand if you knew that you didn't pull the trigger on the gun that killed Dr. King, why you would go that far and say those things.
Well, this was all decided on March the 9th, the day before the plea was entered. At that time, I determined that there was no way that I could force Percy Foreman to go on trial with any prospects of success. But I assumed if I did enter a plea of guilty and I could have had an investigation after the plea with newly discovered evidence, there's a possibility that the case could have been reversed and went to trial.
That same day when you entered your guilty plea, there was a whole series of questions involving the voluntary nature of your plea, that you knew what you were doing, that you weren't being forced, that you knew you were giving up your right to appeal. All of those things were laid out to you, and you answered to all of those, yes, you knew what you were doing.
If I had it all to do over again, I really don't see how I could have done anything different.
If somebody else did it, why sit here silent? Why not tell everything you know and do everything you can to find the other people?
Well, I don't know. I think a lot of people have a sort of a Pollyanna view of the legal system. All you got to do is go to the prosecutor and say, "Oh, here's what it is. It turned me loose." No, that's it. But that's not the way it is. If you testify to the prosecutor, he'll just use what you tell him to weave it into his story. It doesn't necessarily mean he's going to turn you out or anything like that.
The Attorney General, if I read his language correctly, and perhaps I don't, at least in a between-the-lines fashion, has held out the following prospect: that if you would reveal to him information that you've never revealed before, help solve the, quote, conspiracy aspects, unquote, of the case, that perhaps some arrangement could be worked out for a reduction of your sentence. Now, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't think much of anything about that. This thing of being a state witness, or even being perceived to be a state witness, is there's a lot of pitfalls there. I mean, you can look at these people like Valach and them winds up dying solitary confinement. If I testify for anyone, it'd be for myself. And I'm not concerned with the state's case. That's their problem. I don't want to get involved in any type of thing, any type of situation whereby I would have to rely on the Justice Department, because they have I think they have sort of an inherent hostility to anyone from my background anyway, so I'd rather keep them at arm's length.
Would you be willing to talk here at the prison with the Attorney General?
No, I can't see any advantage of having an ex parte meeting with the Attorney General. I have no objections if he wants to question me under oath on a witness stand.
Well, let me stop for a moment and ask you, are you willing to testify before the House committee set up to look into the death of Dr. King as well as the John Kennedy assassination?
I think it would all depend. I think if they're going on the premise that I'm guilty and they're just, the only thing they're interested in is finding out maybe who else is involved, I don't see much point in me testifying then. If I do testify, I wouldn't want to testify in any type of executive session, and the various members leak various, well, not members of Congress, but members of staff leak information out like they did the church committee. You know, they'll say Ray said this and Ray said that. I would rather testify in public, not necessarily on TV or anything, but have a public record where it'd be available to anyone who was interested in it.
According to Ray, he was in Memphis on the day of the assassination under instructions from a man he says he knows only as Raoul, a man whose instructions he claims he had been following for a year. He says he thought Raoul brought him to Memphis to take part in a gun-running scheme.
Could you describe Raoul for me?
Well, I couldn't describe him except to say he appeared to be a Latin, average height, 5 feet or 150 pounds. The hair was the only thing that was that standing out. Most of the Latins are dark-haired, and he was had kind of an auburn look, dark auburn. That's the only thing that really distinguished him from anyone else. Of course, I suppose you could dye your hair or something if you wanted to.
Did he at any time give you any indication of his being in contact with or belonging to any group?
No, my impression was it was more or less of some type of things for monetary gain. There was no mention of politics or anything like that.
Did he ever mention to you the possibility of assassination or hitman operation?
No, I don't. That would have been that would have been kind of out of my league. I don't really think I have the Constitution for all that type of stuff. I don't say that as a virtue. Actually, it's might be a handicap in this type of society.
And on the bothersome question of where the money came from.
Altogether, I spent, I think, it was between $9,500 and $10,000. So,
excuse me, this is from the time you escaped from the Missouri prison in April of 1967 to the time you were arrested in London after the King killing in 1968. Correct. You estimate you spent between $9,500 and $10,000.
It has to be somewhere in between there, yes.
Where did you get the money?
Well, I suppose I got a certain amount. I never got a large sum of money at one time. I think $2,000 most I ever came across at one time. And I got this off the individual I mentioned, this Raul or alias or whatever you want to call him.
You have to know how many people who hear you tell this story will say to themselves, that is a cock and bull story if ever I heard one.
Yeah.
That James Earl Ray has got himself in a world of trouble. He's trying to concoct some story that will help him out of it, and this Raoul never existed, and that thing's fantasy from beginning to end.
I think so. I think I'd have based on my background, you know, in jails now. I think people would be skeptical of anything I testified to the media.
Let me see if I understand you here. That you're saying, all right, you understand that people are skeptical, perhaps even cynical about your story of Raoul and all of this, but that you're convinced that if you could put yourself under oath and put other people under oath with wide-ranging subpoena powers, that it would be proven that Raoul did exist?
I don't know if there's certain individual. I think it'd be proven that someone did exist, whether it's that particular name or not. But I think I could have my previous testimony corroborated.
What about the charge that you're a racist? Always have been.
If I ever went before a jury and you know, tried to pretend like that I would spend a lifetime as a humanitarian and ministering to the poor and all that stuff, they know I was either crazy or lying. So there's a lot of self-segregation in the United States. I think a good example is probably in federal prisons.
No, but what we're driving at here is something deeper than that.
Yeah, you're talking about
that you've hated black people, always hated black people. That's.
Well, I think that's nonsense.
True?
I think I usually judge someone. You have on these, you know, the individual person, but But I think there is an instinctive tendency to associate people that you have something in common with, your background, things like that. I don't think that's means you're plotting to kill the other person or anything like that, but just it's an inconsequential thing, what I consider.
I want to run past you various theories that have been put to me as a reporter working on this assassination case over a good many years, and get your reaction to them as theories. First, that unnamed money interests were somehow responsible for Dr. King's death. They wanted to prevent Dr. King from leading his People's March on Washington, for one thing.
Well, that's the theory I've heard most, and the one that attorneys discuss most. They say he got beyond the integration stage and was interested in economics.
Well, another of the theories is that white racists were responsible for this. Their motive for wanting to get rid of Dr. King was obvious.
No, I think that would be totally false. I think it was their theory that Dr. King's activities was actually helping them politically.
3, the theory involving black militants being responsible, that Dr. King had become too nonviolent for their plans and they wanted to take away leadership for their black movement.
No, that's one of the 2 theories that I think the attorneys representing me wanted to put forward. But I can't subscribe to that type of theory.
How about the communists who, so the theory goes, wanted to stir up black hatred and foment rebellion? Fidel Castro, for example, has claimed had a special interest in this.
No, I doubt it very much.
Have you ever thought about a possible connection between the Dr. King death, your situation, and the assassination of President Kennedy?
Well, the lawyers have discussed it, but I don't think that's a valid theory at all, because...
You don't?
I don't think you can string a bunch of homicides together because there's different motives and different interests.
When I asked one of your former attorneys what your basic story was, this is what he said to me, and I quote directly. James Earl Ray would like to have the credit for killing Dr. Martin Luther King, but does not want to have to pay the price.
That type of conversation there is, that's more suitable for something entertaining, talk shows or something like that. But there's no, someone would have to be insane to, get involved in wanting publicity, killing someone for publicity, because to me it is. I can't conceive of anyone, there is people like that, but I can't conceive of anyone wanting that type of publicity.
And you didn't do it?
No, I didn't do it.
James Earl Ray's story comes down to this, that he didn't do it, and the state certainly has never proved it in court. To someone familiar with the case, Ray's story seems to show that, for the time being at least, Ray is unwilling, or perhaps unable, to shed any really new light on the King assassination.
Santos Trafficante, the last survivor of 3 underworld figures involved in alleged CIA plots to kill Fidel Castro, appeared before the House Assassinations Committee under subpoena today, but Trafficante took the 5th. Bernard Shaw reports.
Trafficante appeared reluctantly before the committee, fully aware of the unsolved murders of 2 other underworld figures mentioned in previous congressional testimony about assassination plots. Sam Momo Giancana was shot in his suburban Chicago home 2 years ago after Senate investigators tried to question him. And the hacked-up body of John Rosselli was found stuffed in a floating oil drum last summer near Miami. Today, the man who once ran syndicate gambling in Cuba showed up without the documents he was ordered to bring, and 15 times he refused to answer questions ranging from whether he had prior knowledge of plans to kill President Kennedy to whether he was visited in a Cuban jail by Jack Ruby. Early on in the questioning, Trafficante's lawyer objected to the lights, cameras, and radio reporters and had them removed from the committee room. The committee decided to keep Trafficante under subpoena, and Chairman Louis Stokes warned that by not answering questions, Trafficante was flirting with a contempt of Congress citation. Bernard Shaw, CBS News, Washington.
James Earl Ray, who was serving 99 years for the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, is scheduled to give a deposition to the committee next week. President Carter is
this time the committee calls Dr. Bodden.
witness stand, please, and be sworn. Sir, you solemnly swear the testimony you give before this committee is the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. So help you God.
I do.
Record at this point.
Dr. Bodden, will you describe for the committee what is depicted in this exhibit?
The first exhibit is a drawing from various photographs taken of the wound and injury pattern of Dr. King just prior to autopsy, but after medical attention had been given to Dr. King in the emergency room at St. Joseph's Hospital, and illustrates the initial gunshot wound of entrance, which is up near 2 o'clock from your perspective, approximately 1 inch to the right of the angle of the mouth and a ½ inch below the angle of the mouth, where the bullet, a high-velocity rifle bullet, struck the cheek, causing an entrance perforation which the superior part is still intact, the typical entrance abrasion collar, and causing bursting lacerations of the inferior aspect of the cheek and chin, in part caused by the high velocity of the missile and in part caused by the fracture effects when the bullet struck the jawbone or the mandible in this area. There are many fragments of bone present. The doctors describe this perforation of the cheek as entering into the mouth proper, and the bullet then exited the bottom portion of the right side of the chin and re-entered in the root or base of the neck above the collarbone and continued from right to left, from front to back, and a downward direction in the body proper. The injury caused by the missile, the rifle bullet, has been distorted somewhat by the resuscitation attempts performed at the hospital emergency room. Specifically, there has been elongation made of the lower border of the re-entrance wound in an attempt of surgical intervention to stop the bleeding that was present. In the next exhibit, Mr. Webb, if I may.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd like the next drawing entered as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-2.
Without objection, it may be entered into the record at this point.
The next exhibit was an attempt at reconstruction by the medical panel together with Ms. Dox and the treating physicians at St. Joseph's Hospital, who went over this material with us, to reapproximate what the injury was prior to the surgical intervention. The top portion is the same. The entrance perforation and the bursting explosive-like injury caused on impact, as well as the re-entrance wound reapproximated. The dotted line extending downward towards 6 o'clock is the reconstructed surgical incision made by the physicians in the emergency room to better stop the bleeding. And this caused the appearance, which was seen in the photo in the previous drawing, with enlargement of the lower border of the entrance perforation. Not shown on the diagram is a tracheostomy, a incision that was made on an emergency basis to assist Dr. King in breathing when he came to the emergency room. If you will note, there is a bridge of skin still intact in the neck, which represents the inner crease of the neck, which was not torn completely through when the missile entered, exited, and re-entered, and assisted Dr. Francisco, the chief medical examiner in Tennessee who did the autopsy, in determining that Dr. King's position of the head had to be downward and slightly to the right at the time of impact, so that the trajectory, the track through the body spared the inner crease in the neck when held in that position.
Excuse me, Dr. Bodden. Dr. Francisco, in his autopsy report, identified a blackened debris present in the skin, which he described as having an unidentifiable form. Did the panel consider the section of skin that Dr. Francisco referred to?
Yes, Mr. Webb. In evaluating and preparing the diagrams and drawings, the panel did have the benefit of the autopsy report, medical reports, all the microscopic sections and slides that had been made, the paraffin blocks that are normally made in preparing microscopic slides, the x-rays, and interviews with the doctors involved. We did identify 2 slides of skin, microscopic sections, normally taken at autopsy examinations, with Dr. Francisco as being taken from this area of entrance. And within those fragments of skin were some black debris, which is not uncommon to see in gunshot wounds of entrance. The panel was entirely satisfied that the black debris in no way represented powder, which would indicate closeness of the gunshot wound, but did indicate debris that can be seen in distant gunshot wounds. We did, with the assistance of the committee, speak with a company in Chicago that is an expert in trace evidence, McCrone Associates, and with them they were able to remove by micro methods a portion of this black debris, and were able by various tests to identify the black debris as lead, which is what we would expect to derive from the soft nose of the bullet in question, which is composed of lead. And the panel is entirely satisfied that the black debris seen in the skin derives from the nose of the bullet.
Dr. Bodden, will the complete report of McCrone Associates, as well as the other materials you refer to, be appended to your final report?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Would you continue to describe the nature of the injuries as depicted in that drawing?
Yeah, the drawings do identify clearly the site of entrance of the gunshot wound. The next drawing will identify where the bullet lodged and terminated.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like the next drawing entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-3.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record at this point.
That's correct. Thank you. The next exhibit is a drawing and tracing, as the other 2 were, of Dr. King as seen in one of the black and white photographs taken after death and prior to autopsy, with Dr. King laying on his right side on a stretcher. So the right shoulder is against the stretcher and the left shoulder is up, and in the left upper back, 3 inches to the left of the midline of the body, the midline being where the spine is present, is a protuberance of the skin showing where the bullet lodged, or the remnant of the bullet lodged, at the termination of the track in the body. The bullet entered in the right chin and neck area, went through the coursed through the body, and terminated just beneath the skin on the left upper back. And it is not uncommon for bullets so lodge beneath the skin because of the various properties of the skin that inhibits bullets passing through it.
Dr. Bodden, did the panel have occasion to examine the clothing worn by Dr. King at the time of his death?
Yes. The clothing worn by Dr. King had been preserved and was made available for inspection by the medical panel. And
Mr. Chairman, the next series of exhibits are photographic enlargements of Dr. King's clothing. At this time, I'd like to have the first such exhibit entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-4.
Yes, without objection, it will be entered into the record at this point.
Dr. Bodden, will you describe for the committee what can be seen in this exhibit?
The next exhibit shows the suit jacket that Dr. King was wearing at the time the gunshot wound was inflicted, and shows tearing of the inner portion of the lapel of the jacket where the bullet track passed from beneath the chin on the right side into the neck region. The lapel of the jacket was not completely torn through. Only the outer lining of the suit material is torn, which is entirely consistent with our judgment that the jacket was along the border of the entrance perforation.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd like to have the next photograph entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-5.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record at this point.
Dr. Bodden, will you describe this exhibit for the committee, please?
Yes. The bullet missile, after leaving the chin, continued through the clothing in the area of the upper neck region and tangentially struck the outer jacket, but did perforate through the collar as is depicted in the photograph on this exhibit. And this collar is torn through and can better be seen on the next photograph when the collar is stretched out in the course of the track of the missile.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to have the next exhibit, the photograph of Dr. King's shirt, entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-6.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record at this point.
Thank you.
This exhibit shows the laceration and tearing of the fabric of the shirt, which was interposed in the course of the bullet track. And this did permit chemical tests on the shirt and on the jacket in 1968, and again recently by the expert consultants for the committee, which demonstrated in 1968 and again now that there was no powder residue on the clothing, as there was none on the skin, and indicate that the gunshot firing was not close and not contact.
Dr. Bodden, the recent testing you referred to is the testing done by the firearms panel hired by the committee?
Yes, sir.
And would you identify the name of the test they employed, please?
There were a number of tests done. The clothing was looked at with the naked eye, was looked at with a microscopic lens, and there was no powder residue apparent. A chemical test for nitrites, a Grice test, was performed, which would identify nitrites, which is a product of gunpowder residue as a bullet is fired from the barrel of a gun. This was not present, but a sodium rhodizonate test for lead particles was present, was positive, and did indicate, as was present in the skin, particles of lead entirely consistent deriving from the nose of the bullet that did lodge in the fabric around the tears of the jacket and the shirt.
Dr. Bodden, so I understand you correctly, the difference between this exhibit and the previous one is that in the previous exhibit, the shirt was in the wearing position, where this one is stretched out to illustrate the wounds?
Yes, I think this shows the tear in the fabric more clearly than the previous one, but the prior exhibit showed the shirt as it would have been worn.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to have entered into the record the final photographic exhibit of the clothing as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-7.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record at this point.
Thank you. Dr. Bodden, will you describe what's depicted in this photograph, please?
Yes, Mr. Webb. This photograph shows the tie worn by Dr. King and the tearing on the right lower border where the missile went through the clothing of Dr. King and does indicate approximately where the re-entrance perforation was on the body of Dr. King, having gone through the area of the shirt, tie, and jacket.
Dr. Bodden, can you state whether or not the severed area of the tie was subjected to the sodium rhodizonate testing?
I believe that the tie was also so tested and also had some lead particulate matter.
Thank you. Dr. Bodden, was the panel able to reconstruct the wound track through the body?
Yes, the panel did do such a reconstruction.
And will you tell us what was the primary basis or the primary material you used to accomplish that?
Well, in addition to the autopsy report, the medical reports, the clothing, the photographs, of great value to the medical panel in reconstructing the track in the body were x-rays taken after death and prior to autopsy at St. Joseph's Hospital and made available to the committee.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to have two x-rays of Dr. King entered in the record as Martin Luther King exhibits F-9 and F-10, the first being F-9.
Without objection, they will be entered into the record at this point.
Dr. Bodden, using these exhibits, would you describe the tract of the wound through the body?
Yes, Mr. Webb. The x-ray seen here show the fractures of the right jawbone, the right mandible, with little white flecks of metal indicating fragments of the bullet that remained in the mandible after impact. So the bullet, and this does show Dr. King in the anatomic position. When x-rays are taken of this nature and when autopsies are performed, all measurements are made as if the decedent were laying flat on the back with the head and body straight, the arms at the side, palms frontward position. And this is referred to as the anatomic position. And in this manner, the face is pointing forward, the fractures of the mandible and the metal fragments are seen at the side of the jaw. There are a few fragments present in the skin at the base of the neck, and about 8:30, almost 9 o'clock on the diagram, are multiple fragments where the missile re-entered just above the collarbone, which was intact, the clavicle. The track proceeded by x-ray, and as we had full cooperation from Dr. Francisco and his staff in reconstructing what happened, we also had full cooperation from various radiologists, x-ray experts, in consulting with us on these films. The track proceeds from right to left, spraying fragments of metal in the course because of the impact with bone, the mandibular bone and various ribs that were fractured and part of the spine that was fractured. At each impact, more metal fragmenting. The track proceeds to the left, and on the leftmost portion of the X-ray is the main missile fragment, which weighed about 65 grains when recovered, which is a little less than half of its original size, which would have been 150 grains. Now, all this white material are metal bullet fragments. On the X-ray on my far left, one can see more clearly the fractures of the ribs, the first rib and the second rib in the back that has been fractured in the course of the missile track. There are fractures along the spine about the lowermost cervical vertebra and the uppermost thoracic vertebra. There is spine injury that is very severe, and the missile track continues into the left upper back region. The X-ray also shows how the fragment is movable depending on position of the body, whereas the fragment here is within the shadow of the clavicle or collarbone. In this X-ray, it is above it because of slight movement of the body, and this has pertinence in determining the bullet track through the body, whereas here the bullet track almost appears horizontal. In this X-ray, it's downward, perhaps a 30-degree angle, and the track in the body varies greatly on position at autopsy.
Dr. Bodden, you've identified a number of bony structures fractured by the bullet in its course. Would this have had a relationship to the direction the bullet took through the body?
Yes. Although bullets essentially travel in a straight line, even after striking areas of the body, the bones struck in this particular instance, the jawbone, the back of the ribs, the spine, are of substantial nature and could cause deflection from a straight line of many degrees.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like the final drawing of Mrs. Dox entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-11.
Without objection, it will be entered into the record at this point.
Dr. Bodden, will you use this drawing to summarize the findings of the panel with respect to the wound tract and the nature of Dr. King's injuries?
Yes, sir. This was a reconstruction done with Ms. Dox in close consultation with the medical panel and is not a tracing of prior photographs. It does illustrate the path of the bullet in the body, beginning 1 inch to the right and a ½ inch below the angle of the mouth, causing extensive fractures of the mandible of the jawbone, continuing downward, injuring many vital structures at the base of the neck. This area of injury is identified by a shaded line because the panel felt that we could not be precise in identifying all of the structures injured. There are major blood vessels, major nerves present in this area. The spinal column is present. And what is drawn are areas that we felt are specifically injured. The internal jugular vein, which is the main blood vessel bringing blood from the brain to the heart. The common carotid artery behind it, which is the main blood vessel bringing blood to the brain. The subclavian artery branch, which brings blood to the right arm, the vertebral artery, which brings blood to the back of the brain, and the spine itself are all, in the opinion of the medical panel, injured by this high-velocity missile wound. The various black areas show many, but not all, of the bullet fragments that are deposited in the course of the gunshot track and which are evident on the x-rays. And on the back is the major fragment that was removed and subjected to various ballistic tests, and this black area would represent the recovered major bullet fragment as we had seen protruding in the left upper back region on a previous exhibit.
Dr. Bond, will you describe the nature of the injuries with respect to the ribs?
The first two ribs are illustrated in the diagram here, and the back portions where the rib meets the spine are clearly fractured and have been displaced and are not present on the x-rays. This is illustrated in the diagram, and at this point where the rib joins the spinal column, there's extensive injury to the spinal column, the bony structure within which the spinal cord resides. And this was extensive, the bones were extensively damaged.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, counsel will have no further questions of the witness.
Thank you, counsel. Dr. Bodden, you may return to the witness table. So you need him? You want him over there? Doctor, I understand you may stay there. Sorry. At this time, the chair will recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. McKinney, for such questioning or such time as he may consume, after which the other members will examine the witness under the 5-minute rule. Mr. McKinney?
Dr. Budd? Dr. Budd, it's good to see you again. Thank you for your help. Did the panel review the medical treatment that was given Dr. King right after his being shot?
Yes, sir. We reviewed the medical records kept at St. Joseph's Hospital, and we did speak at some length with two of the treating doctors, Dr. Gallion and Dr. Rufus Brown, in Memphis, who were very cooperative.
So in other words, you reviewed both the records as well as talked to the attending physicians. Could
Yes.
Could you describe for the committee what sort of treatment that Dr. King received?
Yes, sir. In critical review, the committee was entirely impressed with the vigorous medical attention Dr. King did receive when he arrived at 6:15 at the hospital emergency room, and that Dr. King did indeed have a pulse. The heart was still beating when he arrived, but that in fact the brain was irreparably damaged from the point of admission to the hospital, that the doctors did vigorously attempt to apply appropriate resuscitation measures, including surgical procedures, and that after almost an hour, 50 minutes of this intensive medical treatment did determine that Dr. King's life was irretrievable.
Dr. Budd, did the panel come to any specific conclusions with respect to the actual cause of Dr. King's death?
Yes, the panel felt that the cause of death was a combination of extensive hemorrhage and blood vessel injuries, as well as damage to the nerves and spinal cord of Dr. King. Now, in part, that was arrived at because of the findings of the doctors in the emergency room and their written material at that time.
Were the panel's conclusions consistent with the findings of Dr. Francisco and his autopsy?
In general terms, yes, but with some slight distinction. Dr. Francisco classified the cause of death as severance of the spinal cord, which is the main pathway for all impulses from the brain to the rest of the body. And this was identified from discussions from the autopsy proper and subsequently from discussions with the various doctors involved, but the tract itself was not dissected because Dr. Francisco felt it was unnecessary and an unnecessary mutilation of the body at that time. So the medical pathology panel, in reviewing the findings, was not able to be specific in that the cord was cut and transected completely, but we were satisfied that the closeness of the missile tract through this area of the body would have caused significant damage to the cord, to the spinal cord, even if it was not mechanically cut in half because of the lines of force emanating from the bullet as it struck the spine bones proper.
Was the panel able to determine in any way the origin of the fatal shot?
In a general term, that the reconstruction of the injuries seen at autopsy and photographs indicate that Dr. King had to have been in a position with his face downward and to the right, and that the missile would have had to come from an area to his right. We could not distinguish between the second floor of the bathroom at 418 South Main Street and the bushy area in the yard behind it. That we could not distinguish.
In other words, we have no direct knowledge of what Dr. King's position really was when he was standing on the balcony.
We don't have it specifically, but we have an approximation from witnesses, and even if there were a photograph of Dr. King standing in a precise position at the time of impact of the missile, the autopsy itself is not sensitive enough to distinguish the 2 to 5 degree difference between the bathroom window and the grassy knoll.
But there is nothing inconsistent in your findings between, say, the second floor of Bessie Brewer's or the ground level behind the
That's correct. This is entirely consistent with either of those positions. And which position it was would have to be concluded by other types of investigation beyond the autopsy.
Did the panel review the autopsy procedures used on Dr. King and by Dr. Francisco?
Yes, Ms. McKinney.
Do you think that the autopsy was sufficient, and do you essentially agree with it?
The medical panel agrees with the conclusion that Dr. King died as a result of a single high-velocity rifle injury through the face and body as described. And we agree that the findings of the autopsy of Dr. Francisco, who is a fine forensic pathologist, did establish a valid and satisfactory cause of death. However, if one looks to an autopsy to answer questions other than cause of death, then the tracing of the bullet track proper at the time of autopsy would have given additional information for questions that might arise later. And in this regard, I would say parenthetically that unfortunately in these United States, there is no standard of how to do an autopsy examination of a person who dies as a result of homicide. And one of the charges given to us by Professor Blakey has been to evaluate this area of homicide autopsy investigation as presently exists.
Well, in your rather long experience in this business, is the wound that occurred, is it consistent with that type of gun that's alleged during the shooting from that amount of distance? In other words,
yes, Mr. McKinney, the injuries seen on Dr. King with the bursting explosive-like injury of the face and the trajectory and pathway through the body and the injuries incurred are entirely consistent with a .30-06 rifle as was used in this instance.
So that we can rule out, as a conclusion, I would suppose, all of the other theories we've heard that he might have been shot from closer up, or he might have been...
We can say beyond reasonable medical and scientific certainty that the muzzle of the rifle, and it had to be a rifle because it's a .30-06 bullet that was recovered and that we evaluated and looked at. In fact, Mr. McKinney, may I just show another exhibit?
Certainly.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman?
Certainly.
In fact, this is a photograph taken by Dr. Francisco of the bullet that he removed from Dr. King at the time of autopsy, and which he labeled with the number 252, and he identified this photograph in smaller version to the medical panel in Memphis as the same missile he retrieved in 1968. This shows the copper jacketing. This is a 30 millimeter .30 .3006 bullet that was removed, and may I have the next photo?
May we have that particular exhibit identified? Mr. Webb, will you identify it for us?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This is a photograph of the same bullet fragment twice, and we would ask that it be entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F12.
Without objection, it may be entered into the record.
The lower portion is the base with the Dr. Francisco's marking on it, and the upper photograph shows the side with lands and grooves and the deformity of the front of the bullet, which was soft nose, lead, not covered with a jacket, that was deformed on impact with the very strong mandible and the very strong spine bones.
Mr. Chairman, since Dr. Bodden plans to use the next photograph as an exhibit, we would ask that it's a photograph of the same bullet shown in 3 pieces. We would ask that it be entered into the record as Martin Luther King Exhibit F-13.
Without objection, it may be entered into the record at this point.
Yeah, Mr. McKinney, this is an answer to the question about the bullet itself, which we can identify without question as being the injuries caused by this bullet because of prior identification by Dr. Francisco that he removed it. We saw it on X-ray. When we looked at the bullet, when the medical panel looked at the bullet, which is presently in the possession of the committee, it is presently in 3 pieces because the lead core had loosened over the years, and in fact was in 3 portions when Dr. Francisco testified in the trial in Memphis in 1969. But is the same bullet with the lead core out, the metal jacket with the number at the base, and another portion of the metal jacket. And so that we know that this bullet was retrieved from Dr. King, and we do know from the lack of any gunpowder residues on the face or clothing, as seen in photographs, in pictures, on the microscopic slides of the skin, and on tests of the clothing, that this could not have been a contact or a near discharge of the weapon. It had to be from a distance at least beyond 2 feet or so, but beyond 2 or 3 feet is the limit of sensitivity of this kind of test that we performed. Entirely consistent with being at the Main Street suggested area of shooting.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McKinney. Dr. Bodden, at one point there when Mr. McKinney was questioning you, you inadvertently, I think, used the term grassy knoll. You had reference to the bush area
grassy
there?
Bush, yes, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
Grassy bush.
Chair recognizes gentleman from North Carolina, Judge Pryor.
Thank you, Dr. Biden, and we appreciate your thoroughness. I think it may have some more important long-range effects and might appear immediately. It may sometimes appear as if we are laboring the obvious here. But one thing which needs to be determined is the trajectory pattern, and you have indicated that an autopsy cannot distinguish the small difference between a trajectory from the bushes and from the bathroom window.
Yes, sir.
So that in the future, I don't think the idea that perhaps if a proper autopsy or scientific investigation had been done, we would know exactly from whence it came, that's a question that should occur again.
That's correct, sir.
Also, on the powder debris, you have worked with, as I understand it, a series of chemical tests on the tie, on the shirt material, and from the skin of the wound itself, and have indicated that that powder could only be from the lead tip of the bullet. Is that correct? It could not be from any close-in shot fired.
That's
not
correct.
Close-range powder.
It's actual lead from bullet material rather than powder from the close discharge of a bullet. Yes, sir.
And that it, of course, had to be a rifle and not a pistol.
That's correct, and that's determined by finding the bullet and also by the nature of the wound itself, which is of a high velocity type as opposed to a pistol, which is low velocity generally.
Thank you, Dr. Biden. We appreciate your testimony today.
Thank you, sir.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Devine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Baden, do both Dr. Coe and Dr. Davis agree with the findings that you have related to this panel here this morning?
Yes, sir.
Any area of dissent among the three of you?
The only area of difference would not be in any of the findings as to that I've related, but as to the concept of how extensive an autopsy should be done in a homicidal situation, and particularly relative to the question Mr. McKinney asked, should the bullet track have been dissected? That's a subjective decision that a forensic pathologist has to make based on family wishes, police wishes, as well as in anticipation of further medical or legal questions that might arise. And whereas one forensic pathologist might feel that the track should be extensively dissected, another might feel that what was done answered the questions and the dissection was not necessary. That's an area, I think, where each of us would have a slight difference of opinion.
Otherwise, you are testifying to what either of the other two gentlemen would testify had they appeared here this morning.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Did the three of you visit the bathroom and the rooming house that was adjacent to the Lorraine Motel?
Yes. Yes, sir.
You viewed from that window the balcony upon which Dr. King was standing at the time of the...
We stood in the bathroom at the South Main Street 418 and viewed the balcony, and then went to the balcony and viewed the bathroom and the yard area. We visited the yard area.
And your conclusion was, as forensic pathologists, that the bullet that entered Dr. King may have been fired from that area or that vicinity?
Our conclusions were that it was entirely consistent with the bullet having been fired from the bathroom area, yes.
Fine. Well, Doctor, as a former prosecuting attorney and having examined a number of pathologists as well as witnessed a number of autopsies, I want to thank you for your objectivity, your professional approach, and the lack of equivocation in your testimony is quite helpful to the panel.
Thank you, sir.
The House is in session and the second bells have rung. The committee will take a 10-minute recess at this time.
Glad you're here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank the witness for his testimony. I just have one or two questions, maybe leave it at one. I'd just like to sort of summarize, if I could, with you, Doctor, and your testimony. Is it your conclusion or the conclusion of the panel that, in fact, both wounds, the jaw wound and the neck wound, were caused by the same projectile?
Yes, without question, that is the conclusion of the panel.
And is there any doubt in your own mind that the projectile recovered from Dr. King's body was in fact the cause of his death?
No doubt at all, Mr. Dodd.
And was it furthermore your testimony that the position of the projectile and the best evidence you have on the position of Dr. King at the time of impact would lead you to believe that a shot fired from either that wooded area or in that vertical line somewhere was consistent with the wounds that were caused by that projectile?
Yes, sir. That there's no question in that area is consistent from whence the shot came.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions.
Okay, the chair recognizes gentleman from District of Columbia, Mr. Fontroy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize to the committee for having had to be in attendance at a district committee meeting dealing with the commuter tax. And I want to thank the panel, Dr. Bowden, for their testimony here today. My son has had an opportunity to bring me up to date on your presentation to the committee, and I just want to be sure of a couple of things. The first, Dr. Bowden, is that it is clear that the bullet which struck Dr. King came from the right, and is it safe to say that it came from above?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
That it could not have come, say, from the ground?
On the basis of the autopsy alone, we cannot be certain as to which direction the bullet came from, except up or down, except if we incorporate other informations as to Dr. King's approximate position that we feel is reliable, that he was standing on the balcony and not lying down, for example, at the time of firing. The committee concluded, utilizing other non-autopsy materials and information, that the missile would have come from slightly above or perhaps horizontal.
But certainly not from below?
Not from below the balcony.
Okay. Is it clear also that only one shot was fired?
It is clear from the autopsy that one and only one shot struck Dr. King.
I see.
We could not, for example, relate to misses, if a shot missed, but one and only one shot, high-velocity rifle bullet struck Dr. King.
Now, was the amount of lead present in the body consistent with what would have remained from a 150-grain bullet after the 64-grain fragment had been removed?
Our basis for reaching a judgment to that question, sir, specifically includes the X-rays available to the panel, of which there were approximately 7, some original and some not original, and that these X-rays, together with the autopsy findings, clearly indicate that the amount of bullet fragments in the body are entirely consistent with deriving from the single bullet, of which 64 to 65 grains were recovered. The remainder is consistent with what is missing from the bullet.
Thank you, Dr. Bowden, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question, Doctor. It's true, is it not, that when a high-velocity missile or bullet strikes a body, that it causes extensive damage and severe damage to tissue out beyond its track because of the lines of force it creates within the body? Isn't that true?
Yes, sir. That's very much true. And that is pertinent in part to the injuries to Dr. King, because we do know, for example, that the spine bones, lower neck and the upper chest spine bones were impacted by the bullet. If the bullet continued through the spinal canal, it would have severed the spinal cord. If it didn't continue through the spinal canal and sever the spinal cord, the lines of force from the impact would have severely damaged the spinal cord without even touching it. And that much of the extensive hemorrhage and destruction of the tissues in the face and neck area of Dr. King were due to the lines of force that you allude to, sir.
Thank you, sir. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Burke.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Bowden. I have a couple of questions. You indicate that based upon the lack of powder burns, that the trajectory could not have been fired less than 2 feet. Is there a maximum in footage it could have been fired to produce the wound and the other damage? Based upon the kind of a rifle?
Yes, and this, your question goes beyond the expertise of the medical panel and into the expertise of the firearms panel, which has information specifically to the point you're raising, but a rifle of this type could inflict this type of damage beyond 100 yards, for example, and maybe well beyond that, which will be information available to the committee when the firearms panel
you indicated there was other information that you used in order to determine the direction of the trajectory. Could you give us, you say, for instance, he had to be standing, not lying down. Could you give us the other information or collateral information you based your findings on?
The point I tried to make was that at autopsy we can dissect a track or determine a track, and the relative relationship between a gun or rifle and the track at the moment of firing. At the moment of firing of this weapon, the barrel of the gun had to be somewhat in a slight slightly upward from the horizontal in relationship to striking the chin and the body, somewhat of an angle I'm presenting with this pointer. Now, that's what we can tell at autopsy. Whether Dr. King was laying on his back or frontwards or on the side or on the opposite side, this same trajectory could be maintained as long as the relationship between the firearm and the body is kept intact. So one could have a similar track if he were standing on his head, for example, if the person firing were in the appropriate position. So the additional information that the committee utilized in determining consistency to the bathroom window, for example, was that he had been seen to be standing upright and had been against the railing that was on the balcony, and that he was talking to somebody and from below. And once we established that he was upright, we cannot know how much he was hunched forward or backwards, for example, but that immediately limits the possibilities and makes the trajectory as coming from the direction of 418 South Main Street reasonable.
Well, what I'm trying to get at, did you also assume that he was a certain place on the balcony? Did you assume, well, I'm trying to determine all of the assumptions that you made in order to arrive at that conclusion. For instance, did you determine he was against the rail?
We had information that appeared reasonable to us that he was touching the railing, standing up outside of the room in front of which he died. We could not establish, for purposes specifically of the engineers, how high his cheek was, the point of entry was, from the ground. We do know, for example, in the autopsy protocol, the entrance in the cheek is, I believe, 59 inches above the right heel, which is a true type of measurement taken at autopsy. So that he could have, if he were standing bolt upright in the anatomic position, he would have been looking straight ahead. He would have been 59 inches above the ground. If, at the point of impact, if he were slouched forward as a normal posture, it could have been as low as 54 inches off the ground. We felt that a reasonable and accurate determination was approximately 56 inches off the ground at the point of impact, and gave this information to the engineering members to utilize as their point of reference above the ground of the balcony. However, in consultation with the engineers who were there, it became readily apparent that the difference in the trajectory from the backyard or the bathroom window between 59 inches and 54 inches, the outermost limits that we felt were reasonable, was less than 1 degree of flight pattern. Each inch is about 1.5 minutes of trajectory, so that the sensitivity of the engineers in developing their track was much more sensitive than the autopsy findings, which cannot distinguish 5 or 10 degrees in this kind of a situation. But that's part of the information we used at arriving at what we thought was a reasonable position for Dr. King. We did look at photographs of Dr. King as he lay on the balcony. We did have information as to persons who were present and made what we felt was a reasonable
time. The gentleman has expired.
Just a very short question. Aside, you mentioned that there was a difference in the autopsy and whether or not the spinal column was severed or whether or not it was damaged. Were there any other areas that you found a difference in your findings and the findings of the autopsy?
Another area was in specific localization of which blood vessels in the neck were torn. And that is the purpose of the reconstruction with the shaded area, to indicate the area that we feel with certain medical certainty was damaged. Whether or not the common carotid artery, for example, was severed or not is not fully clear from all the evidence that we have. But we do know the subclavian artery was severed. And from the point of view of medical treatment, from the point of view of survivability of Dr. King, there is no importance to this distinction. However, from point of view of the medical panel in reviewing the autopsy medical evidence at hand, we wanted to be as accurate as possible, and where we could be certain, we were certain. When we can't be certain, as in the area that have just arisen, we describe what we think probably happened. There probably was damage to the common carotid artery, but we can't be certain about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Has expired. Mr. Ford, gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Doctor, the name of Dr. Spruntz appears on the autopsy report along with Dr. Francisco's as the pathologist. Were you able to determine what role he played in the autopsy findings?
Yes, sir. On our visit to Memphis and in our interviews with Dr. Francisco, we specifically asked them about Dr. Spruntz's contribution to the autopsy, and were definitely advised that Dr. Spruntz's name was placed on the autopsy protocol as was customary at that time, because he was chairman of the Department of Pathology and had certain legal responsibilities deriving therefrom, but that Dr. Spruntz was not present at the time of autopsy and did not contribute to the autopsy. It is was a policy type of adding of his name to the protocol because he was the chairman of the department, and did not necessarily mean that he participated in the autopsy.
Will you describe any constraints Dr. Francisco may have operated under performing the autopsy on Dr. King?
The medical panel, in interviews with Dr. Francisco, were satisfied that Dr. Francisco did not feel any constraints. He expressed to us very strongly that he did what he thought was necessary without any constraints from any parties. One of the areas that the medical panel questioned, and will be present in the final report of the medical panel, has to do with an attitude of who has responsibility in performing of autopsies in homicidal deaths. Does the next of kin, for example, or should the next of kin have a voice in homicidal deaths and whether an autopsy should be done, how it should be done, if it is felt, as many of us in forensic pathology do feel, that the society's interest in the dead body overrides family interests. And in Tennessee, at the time, there was a policy in all homicidal deaths to obtain permission of the next of kin prior to autopsy. Now, that's difficult for members of the panel to evaluate in creating an attitude of possible constraint, who, as myself, who come from other jurisdictions where no such next of kin requirement is necessary, and we do what we think is appropriate, and we can be called to task for it if we exceed our authority. But so that specifically in answer to your question, there was the necessity to obtain next of kin, if not by law, by custom. That is, the district attorney orders the autopsy in Tennessee at that time, and by custom they did obtain permission from the widow of the decedent. Dr. Francisco felt that this in no way caused any constraints, and that his concerns about not causing any unnecessary deformity to the body by dissecting the back and the track arose entirely from his sensitivity to the treatment of the dead body and not from any outside party.
Doctor, you mentioned a policy. Does Tennessee law have any provisions which may have affected the autopsy, whether you know of?
I am aware of certain legal requirements in Tennessee law, but I would not wish to trust to memory, and I would defer to Mr. Webb, perhaps, who is more aware of the legal requirements in Tennessee as existed at that time.
Chair, recognize counsel for the committee, Mr. Webb.
Mr. Ford, in answer to your question, in Tennessee at the time, it was the requirement that the District Attorney General order all autopsies as opposed to the medical examiner, which is the custom in many states. This meant that Dr. Francisco first had to turn to Mr. Canale for permission to perform an autopsy. At that point, the custom of seeking next of kin approval came into being. There was a requirement that next of kin be sent a notification of the intent to perform an autopsy. Mr. Canale required at that point that next of kin's permission be sought and wherever available obtained prior to the autopsy being commenced. That would have been the difference in Tennessee law at the time as opposed to some other jurisdictions.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Fithian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Broughton, appreciate your testimony, and I want to review specifically with you. You did say that the bullet could not have been fired from, say, the courtyard below.
It could not have been fired from the courtyard below, assuming, as we have, that Dr. King was in a standing position at the time of injury.
And it could not have been fired from, say, the firehouse across the street and far to the left. Is that your...
It could not have been fired from that area if we assume, as we have some evidence for, that Dr. King was standing upright, facing the courtyard, and slightly turned to the right. The head slightly turned to the right.
So assuming that Dr. King was not facing into the motel room and was facing out and speaking down to someone in the courtyard, from that position then, you narrow the scope of the degrees from which the bullet had to come. But the engineering combined with your pathology cannot determine or distinguish the azimuth as to whether it came from the second story window or from the ground in the yard below the window. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct, sir.
Would you now, and this is my final question, Mr. Chairman, would you now, using a chair there as the railing, assume for me, as nearly as you can, what you think Dr. King's position would have had to have been in order for the bullet to have made the bullet track it did, assuming that it came from either the second story window or from the bushy area?
Good morning and welcome. I'm Dick Gregory and this is Mark Lane. We're glad so many of you turned out this morning because Mark and myself is very excited over our new book, which is called Codename Zorro, the Murder of Martin Luther King. It kind of throws me why the FBI would have had a code name for Dr. King, Zorro, because if you remember the old movie, Zorro's trademark was he wore a mask and carried a bull whoop. And we all remember King in the days when he led the civil rights movement the mask and the bullwhip was always the trademark of the Ku Klux Klan. So I never understood the whole time the research for the book why that name was code name for King. A lot of people was asking us, do we think the book will be a bestseller? I don't know that, but I know it's already a bestseller at the FBI building. Just let me say that I am pleased and proud to have worked with Mark on probably one of the most important books of our time. And I want to thank the publishers, Printers Hall, and all the researchers and people that believe that the truth would eventually come out. And Mark and I are indebted to a lot of people in America that just kept saying the truth will rise, the truth will rise, and we feel that this book will do a lot for America and will open up the eyes of many people that a lot of things have gone on in this country that we can probably straighten out. And again, I want to thank Mark. Ed Reddick, who was supposed to be with us this morning, had a death in the family, his wife, and he has a couple of teenage kids that's pretty broke up about it. So we'll be holding a press conference with Ed a little bit later. We have here Jerry Ray, which is James Earl Ray's brother. If there's any questions when we open it up that you would like to ask of Jerry, feel free. And right now I would like to introduce the backbone of this whole book, the tremendous effort that was put in. I hope that those of you that's covering this will read the book, just not the conspiracy part. But I found out, as close as I was to Dr. King, in researching and reading his speeches and reading his attitudes and his compassion, that I really never found out what America and the world had lost until I looked through. And the sad part about this book is really the book trying to expose the conspiracy. So a lot of the speeches that we put in the book is an edited version, but I would say to you, please read all of those speeches because it set America on a direction. And I would hope that the President of the United States and the people in his cabinet would learn King and be proud that this America produced a human being of this magnitude and this level. And then maybe we can turn this country around to a direction where the many kings in the black and white neighborhoods, the older folks, the young kids, the women, the minority folks, the poor folks will be able to emerge and give the same type of leadership that Dr. King gave. And I'm just proud to be a part of this book. I'm proud to have been a part of King's movement. And I knew him well, and he was a personal friend. And again, I'm very gratified that, that Prentice Hall gave us the vehicle to expose the many things that we were able to find out, including Martin, the human being. And with that, I'd like to introduce Brother Mark Lane.
In August 1967, in addressing himself to the continuing and growing war in Southeast Asia, Dr. King said that there exists within this country a far deeper malady, and that the war in Vietnam was but symptomatic of a far deeper malady. We are focusing in this book upon the far deeper malady that Dr. King described in the American consciousness, the American soul, and the American spirit. Let me say at the outset, and we do not say this lightly, those of you who have known of my work in the last 13 years know that although I have devoted much of that time to investigating the facts surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, I have never for one moment speculated as to who might have been involved in that assassination. Therefore, I do not say these words lightly now. Our investigation leads us to the conclusion that the eyewitness testimony that is available, that the documentary evidence that is available causes and constrains us to reach the inexorable conclusion that persons in the leadership and officials, other officials of the Federal Bureau of Investigation must be considered to be prime suspects in the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King. We will discuss briefly some of the points which compel that conclusion. J. Edgar Hoover established years before Dr. King's death a group in the Atlanta office of the FBI, which the FBI described themselves as the Destroy King Squad. Their basic assignment was to destroy Martin Luther King. It was the number 2 desk of the intelligence office of the Atlanta office of the FBI. Among other things that office did, for example, was to order Arthur Murtaugh, a special agent of the FBI, who retired after serving 20 years and 9 months with the Bureau, order him to have his 2 informants in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta to steal samples of Andy Young's handwriting. Andy Young was then a candidate for Congress. To steal as well stationery of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference so that the FBI could forge on SCLC stationery, in what purported to be Andy Young's handwriting, love letters to the wives of other black ministers in Atlanta. That was a relatively mild aspect of the illegal actions of the Federal Bureau of Investigation directed against Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Perhaps the pinnacle, so far as we know, prior to the murder of Dr. King, the pinnacle of the FBI attack was probably reached when Mr. Hoover personally ordered that an old FBI typewriter be utilized in drafting and typing a letter to be sent to Dr. King, in essence urging that Dr. King commit suicide. And an FBI agent was dispatched from Washington to fly down to Miami, Florida, so that the postmark on this anonymous letter would be a southern state, so that Dr. King would not realize that the direction came from Mr. Hoover himself. In addition to this, Hoover personally ordered that a doctored tape purporting to show Dr. King involved in some sexual indiscretion be sent to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference just prior to the arrival of the letter, so that Coretta King would hear the tape, and so that in that moment of depression which Hoover envisioned in the conflict between Dr. King and Coretta King, the letter urging him to commit suicide would arrive. The letter arrived, Dr. King opened it up, called in Andy Young and other aides, and said, obviously, this has come from J. Edgar Hoover. Who else would have done such a thing? So the subterfuge did not work. But what is apparent is that it is safe to say, based upon that information, that J. Edgar Hoover wanted Dr. Martin Luther King dead. Otherwise, he would not have sent him a letter urging him, in essence, to commit suicide. The visit of Dr. King to Memphis on March 28, 1968, resulted in a series of occurrences which brought him back there and to his death on April 4th, 1968. A group of FBI agent provocateurs disrupted a peaceful demonstration on March 28, 1968, and turned what was to have been a peaceful march led by Dr. King into a violent confrontation in which mace was used by the Memphis police. For the first time, it was used on a large scale against the citizens of this country. One young black man was shot and died. Others were badly beaten by the police. It then became clear that Dr. King would have to return to Memphis to lead a nonviolent demonstration, particularly since he had planned to lead the Poor People's Campaign to this city the following month. In order to induce Dr. King to move into the Lorraine Motel, two things were done by the FBI. A story was written by the FBI, and it bears the imprimatur letter H, approved by J. Edgar Hoover personally. This was a story which was circulated to the 2 newspapers in Memphis. The FBI even supplied the headline for the 2 local newspapers. The headline was, "Do as I say, not as I do, says King." And then it went on to point out that Dr. King was to return to Memphis, but he was going to stay, no doubt, in a white-owned hotel, the Holiday Inn, Rivermont, which was a large, imposing structure with excellent security. The FBI did not mention the security. The FBI went on in this story, which it wrote, for its friendly, as it reported it, its friendly news media sources in Memphis went on to state that Dr. King really should not call upon other black folks to boycott white people when he himself was staying in a white-owned hotel. Why did Dr. King not move into the Lorraine Motel, said the FBI. It was owned by black people, perfectly fine, respectable hotel, which was patronized by black folks. That was part of it. In addition to that, in order to encourage Dr. King to return to Memphis and to go to the Lorraine Motel, a speech was written by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to be delivered on the floor of the United States Senate, and it was delivered there on March 29, 1968, by Senator Byrd, now the majority leader of the Democratic Party in the United States Senate. He delivered one of the most racist speeches in the recent modern history of this country, in which he referred to Dr. King as a rabble-rouser, a coward who fled from the violence which he himself created, and then went on to say, in this FBI effort to get Dr. King into the Lorraine Motel, Senator Byrd, who perhaps was used unwittingly but nevertheless participated in this effort, Senator Byrd went on to say that no doubt when he comes to Washington, Dr. King will have the black people live with chickens and pigs in some tent city, but he himself will no doubt move into a posh Washington hotel and will no doubt conduct a lay-in. That's what the Messiah will do. Messiah was the FBI code word. Lay-in was the FBI sex espionage program against Dr. King. And the speech, according to Deke DeLoche, was requested by Senator Byrd and then prepared by the FBI for him for delivery on the floor of the Senate. Well, Dr. King did return to Memphis. His commitment to the sanitation workers in that city required that. And he did move into the Lorraine Motel. Just before he got there, however, Dr. King, who had been under FBI surveillance 24 hours a day, eyeball surveillance and electronic surveillance for years, including when he went to Oslo, Norway, to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. The FBI bugged his hotel room in Oslo. Now, for the first time in years, there was no FBI surveillance the moments prior to the murder of Dr. King, and there were no FBI agents involved in eyeball surveillance, and there was no bugging of his room for the first time in many years. And Dr. King's security in Memphis was reduced from 12, and now in the heat of the new controversy which was developing, in the heat of the riot and the hard feelings, it was reduced from 12 to 2. And the man in charge of security was a black detective, warrant officer named Ed Reddit. And this is what Reddit's plan was. Reddit's plan was to establish a command post in Fire Station 2 over here. Go back a little bit. And he and a patrolman who was his assistant, a man named Willie Richmond, was stationed here. And this was the plan they had. Early that morning, April 4th, 1968, because it was clear that there was no security in the Lorraine Motel. This was not the Holiday Inn Rivermont. There was no security here. And it was clear that if anyone wanted to shoot Dr. King, they could have done so from any of these buildings. And the detail had been reduced to 2. And this was Reddit's plan. He said to Richmond, you keep the walkie-talkie. If anything should happen, you run into the area from here, across Mulberry Street, up to the Lorraine Motel and take control there. Use your walkie-talkie and call in the mobile units. He said, will run through the fire station, come to South Main Street, and block off any exit from any of these buildings. It has been said by the government that, in fact, the shot was fired from here, and that the assassin fled out through this building with a rifle, which he dropped over here, and indeed the rifle was found here in front of Knife's amusement parlor. If Reddit's plan had been in effect, he would have come out to South Main Street with his pistol drawn and no doubt would have seen the person run out of the house with the rifle, and the situation would be very different from where we find it now, filled with questions 9 years later. What happened to Reddit? Well, at 4 o'clock that afternoon, Lieutenant Arkin of the Domestic Intelligence Squad of the Memphis Police Department drove up to the fire station and said to Reddit, you must come at once to see Holloman. Holloman was the director of the fire and police, both in Memphis. You must come at once. And he said, I'm in charge of security. I can't leave. And Arkin said, Holloman must see you at once. You must prepare at once with me. He got into the car, and he said, "Who's going to replace me?" Harkin said, "Holloman will take care of it." According to a tape-recorded interview that I did with Ed Reddit and a tape-recorded interview that I conducted with Frank Holloman, who confirmed every essential statement made by Reddit, this is what happened. Reddit entered the office, and Holloman was there with a great deal of police brass all around him, state, local, federal, and he said to Reddit, "This man is from the United States Secret Service. He's told us that there is a death threat against you."
In the 1950s and early 60s, the Lorraine Motel had a claim to fame. It was one of the few motels in Memphis that would rent rooms to blacks. Ironically, the Lorraine's claim on history took another turn on April 4th, 1968, the day civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated while standing on the second-floor balcony. Today, a victim of hard times and a sad history, the Lorraine Motel was put up for sale on the auction block. A group of black businessmen bought it for $144,000. They plan to make it a civil rights memorial.
To be able to have had this opportunity, and I just want to ask you, for the record, did you kill my father?
No, I didn't, no. But like I say, sometimes these questions are difficult to answer. You have to make a personal evaluation, and of course, read some facts Mr. Dr. Pepper's written, things like that, and maybe you can come to a conclusion. But I think it could be done today. I don't think it could be done 30 years ago, because they say, well, he's a communist or something like that. Something that would have nothing to do with the actual offense.
Well, as awkward as this may seem, I want you to know that I believe you, and my family believes you, and we are going to do, myself personally and on behalf of my family, to reach out firsthand and for all time's sake to be able to have had this opportunity. And I just want to ask you, for the record, did you kill my father?
No, I didn't, no. But like I say, sometimes these questions are difficult to answer. You have to make a personal evaluation, and
it was not until recently that the news media just hounded us literally to make a statement, because our policy publicly had been not to comment on it. We just literally tried to move on with our lives. And I think in order to establish truth and justice, it is only through the legal process, through a court of law, that the truth can be obtained. And certainly my father was a warrior for truth.
Dexter King says all of his life he has believed James Earl Ray did not act alone. Now, 29 years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis, Ray's family had a third party to contact the Kings, asking for their support in a new trial.
They had reluctantly reached out to my family in the past because of the awkwardness of it. They never wanted to cross that line, is what was said. They felt it would be inappropriate, but however, in light of the circumstances, James Earl Ray's health, they just felt that they did not want his name to go down in history as being the person who killed Martin Luther King Jr. when they feel that, that he's innocent.
Mr. Ray, did you kill Dr. King?
No, I didn't.
Ray has repeatedly claimed his innocence since recanting his confession in 1968. He had no trial and is serving a 99-year sentence for killing the most famous civil rights leader in America. The call for a new trial is a race against time now, since Ray is dying from cirrhosis of the liver. The King family says this is not the first time they have been contacted about new evidence in the case.
3 to 4 years ago, we were contacted by some of my father's close associates who were in Memphis, and in fact, some had stated they knew who actually killed my father, and it was not James Earl Ray, that they had evidence, and they wanted to, at the time, share this information, and we somewhat avoided it then.
According to the papers filed in criminal court, Ray and his attorneys believe the original investigation into Dr. King's assassination was flawed and obstructed.
Rarely has truth knocked at the door of a courtroom as loudly as the truth is knocking in this case at this time.
This 34-page petition makes numerous claims against the prosecution's case, including witnesses who may have been too drunk to give valid testimony and mishandling of key evidence in the case. Pepper also wants to examine the alleged murder weapon, which a local judge had refused to release to the producers of a television trial. Pepper argues if a grand jury follows the roadmap laid out for it, it would lead not to the infamous boarding house in James Earl Ray, but to corporate boardrooms and the highest levels of government in Washington. And Pepper insists former Memphis businessman Lloyd Jowers, now of Martin, Tennessee, had something to do with the plot.
Do you believe that Lloyd Jowers fired the fatal shot? Do you believe that?
I say that it's open, and I have no belief. My beliefs have to be founded on facts.
But their belief of a cover-up has some former associates of Dr. King supporting Ray's petition for a retrial.
The good people of Memphis and Tennessee need to know the truth about this matter.
James, you know yourself. Are you capable of committing the crime which you are charged?
Well, I doubt it very much, because if I was going to shoot somebody, I'd want to know, what the reason I was going to shoot him. And I've read quite a bit about Reverend Martin Luther King's record since then, and he was against the Vietnam War, and I wasn't no supporter of the war. He was talking about redistributing the wealth, and that didn't affect me. I didn't have any, so he was integrating some places in Chicago, I understand, and that really didn't interest me, because it was always my intention to get out of the country. So whatever impact he had in this country, it wouldn't have affected or interested me.
You say you don't want anybody to believe what you say unless you can document it. Now, you show us the documents on Raoul.
Well, I put a lot of documents out there, but
where?
I think, well, I'm talking about other documents, but we'll get the. I think that's something the jury decide who's fabricating and who isn't. But I've always wanted a trial. If the state had such a good case, they should have had this case resolved 20 years ago.
That's why we're here, Mr. Ray, in part to give you a trial. We want to hear your story.
Well,
we're hearing it.
Yeah, they should have been one 25 years ago.
James Earl Ray, on the 4th of April, 1968, at approximately 1 minute past 6, did you shoot Martin Luther King Jr.?
No, I did not.
Who Killed Martin Luther King Jr.? It's the title of James Earl Ray's new book. It's another conspiracy theory. Ray pleaded guilty to the assassination, but has denied it ever since. He says, like Oswald, he was a patsy.
The people set it up. I think they wanted some type of a, what they call a dumb white dude to, take the rap for it.
Ray's theory sounds a lot like director Oliver Stone's movie version of Who Killed JFK. Ray says that, like Kennedy, King was killed by the establishment, that the FBI considered him a troublemaker and ordered him killed. He says it's in the FBI's files.
They talked about ways to discredit King and eliminate him, things of that nature.
It's easy to believe that the FBI, if not involved, at least did not prevent the assassination from happening.
Circumstantial evidence links Ray to the crime, but unanswered questions suggest a conspiracy. How was the assassin able to flee with so many police present? How did Ray, a convicted felon, get to England where he was arrested? Ray says the answers are in volumes of FBI files, files that are classified.
So here we have 400 or 500 cubic feet of records classified. And the government claims they all support their case, so it looks to me like if they support their case, they should go ahead and declassify them and get the matter resolved.
But the files are classified until the year 2027. Until they are open, the questions will continue. Dan McDonald, News Channel 5.
It's been 30 years since his voice rang out for justice. In April, Dr. Martin Luther King's family asked for justice once more, appealing to the Attorney General, Janet Reno, to reopen the assassination investigation, which Reno did in August.
So that out of this, a fair and hopefully
open process will come about that will allow people to come forward to tell what they know.
But the King family's request to reopen the probe and their belief that James Earl Ray was innocent caught some, like Dr. Barbara Reynolds, a journalist who grew to know the King family over the years, by surprise.
And then Coretta King said the same thing. I think he's innocent. And I said, wait a minute, something's wrong here. You know, this is not the same Coretta King that I've known. Why are they involved?
So Reynolds contacted Dexter King, who told her he believed he had new evidence of witnesses who were never interviewed. She has now asked King and others to join in a panel discussion on the probe, including some who may not believe a new investigation is needed.
There are people who will look at this and say, well, why are they going to spend all this taxpayers' money on reopening this case when we don't want to hear it? But there are other people who are saying, you know, we're tired of all of the focus being on Monica Lewinsky when there are real issues here that people do care about.
Along with King, the Reverend William Fauntleroy, who appeared with the Kings in April and headed up the first King investigation. Various journalists and the Justice Department have all been invited to attend. In Washington, Leanne Necessary reporting.
I'm here only on behalf of the King family to secure, hopefully, what will be answers to the questions they've been seeking for some 30 years.
Former FBI agent Donald Wilson would say little more about the evidence he claims he has, or the reason he's kept it to himself all these years. Although he told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution he didn't pass the documents to his superiors in 1968 because he didn't believe they were conducting a serious investigation. This morning, he presented that evidence to Fulton County DA Paul Howard, along with James Earl Ray's attorney, William Pepper. The evidence, slips of paper he claims he found in James Earl Ray's car in 1968.
It indicates quite clearly the existence of the man whom James Earl Ray has always said was his controller, his handler. It indicates quite clearly the existence of Raoul.
This is the Atlanta connection, Capitol Homes. This is where Wilson says he found those documents inside the white Mustang that James Earl Ray abandoned here. Ray confessed to killing Dr. King in 1968, only to recant a few days later. He claims a shadowy figure named Raoul set him up and told King's son Dexter that last year.
I just want to ask you, for the record, did you kill my father?
No, I didn't, no.
Today, Mr. Wilson refused to discuss the details of the evidence.
I'm not going to make any further comments until I've had the opportunity to meet with the Attorney General, Janet Reno, and provide her with the evidence and answer any and all questions and cooperate fully with her in an effort to get at the truth here.
But late this afternoon, the chief prosecutor in Memphis, Bill Gibbons, told me Ray doesn't deserve a trial.
Absolutely not. Mr. Ray does not deserve a new trial. Mr. Ray is guilty of assassinating Dr. King, and I don't think that anything has come forth indicating otherwise.
Janet Reno orders a review of the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination after meeting yesterday with King's widow. Coretta Scott King told Reno she has new evidence about the crime.
We'll be reviewing the information that she furnished us, reviewing the law, reviewing the facts of the case and the history of the case to see what can be done.
Coretta Scott King wants more than a review. She's asked Reno for a special investigative committee,
which would have a subpoena power, immunity power, and the power to prosecute, because we feel that all this evidence has to be presented in an official body.
James Earl Ray confessed to killing King shortly after the assassination 30 years ago. However, he quickly recanted the confession, and over the years, Ray has tried to convince authorities that he's a patsy and others actually killed King. But a congressional committee and several Tennessee investigations concluded that Ray is the killer.
But many civil rights leaders and, in fact, the American public have long thought that King's killing was a conspiracy and that there were other people involved. In fact, a recent poll revealed that only 1 in 10 Americans actually believe the official story of King's assassination.
The King family says they have new witnesses in the case. They support a trial for Ray, and they think the Justice Department review could be the first step.
Allow people to come forward to tell what they know and not fear being prosecuted, and also that ultimately we can get on with this issue by having reconciliation and ultimately closure.
Reno said today the review will move quickly, but did not set a deadline for completion. In Washington, Pat Rogers reporting.
the night Dr. King was killed, I was standing on the ground and he was on the first floor just above my head. When I arrived at Dr. King, the bullet had hit right here. And I looked across where that bullet had to come from. And I said then, you know, I'm out of the Army, infantryman. Whoever shot that rifle was one of the best gunmen in this world.
Reverend Hosea Williams, known as one of the civil rights activists in Martin Luther King Jr.'s inner circle, describes James Earl Ray as the fall guy.
I never believed James Earl Ray killed Dr. King. He purchased that rifle, but a bullet was never fired at that rifle, and that's why they wouldn't do a ballistic test.
Hosea Williams says a cover-up was hatched to shield the FBI from suspicions and to prevent riots.
You think they were worried about riots? That's why
Yes,
they planned it on?
As long as they have apprehended and arrested the perpetrator, and then, you know, they thought that would settle any riot.
Did you ever think that you would see this day?
I think that the King family can rest and speak out, you know, with confidence that the truth is about to come out, has never been told.
I got a little nervous.
When was the last time the case was opened? Does anybody know?
Shelby County Criminal Court Clerk Bill Key displayed Ray's Remington 30-06 rifle. It has been in a vault for the last 29 years, removed only once so the House Select Committee could fire it in 1978. Firearms experts Bob Hathaway, George Reich, and Marshall Robinson will fire Ray's rifle over the next 3 days. They have 75 years' worth of experience between them. After the firing, it's into the laboratory where the bullets will be examined by this comparison microscope.
Once the test firings are accomplished, we will return to the laboratory where we'll get down to the actual comparison of the evidence bullet to our test bullets and comparison of test bullets to test bullets if necessary.
I'm observing.
But Shelby County Assistant District Attorney John Campbell isn't sure any of this is necessary. He says Ray's guilty plea in March of 1969 stands.
It's gone through the state court 6 times, it's gone through federal court once, and every time the courts have determined that when he pled guilty, he did it knowingly, voluntarily, without threats or promises. So from a legal standpoint, I don't think it's going to lead anywhere.
One of Ray's attorneys even admitted if the experts find a perfect match, his client still wants a trial.
Even if you had a situation where there were similar markings on the assassination bullet and the test bullets, the fact remains that from the very beginning, James Earl Ray has contended that he was not there and this occurred before he came back to check back.
The state wants to stop the Ray hearings in Memphis and criticized 2 Shelby County trial judges for their roles in the case. Judge Joe Brown, who ordered the latest testing of Ray's rifle, and Judge John P. Colton, who allowed this U of M professor to subpoena witnesses. The state says both men overstepped their judicial powers.
The state is arguing to this court that neither Judge Colton nor Judge Brown nor any other judge has the authority to direct an investigation.
So all we ask you for is an opportunity to let this process go forward to its conclusion.
Ray's defense team defended Judge Brown. Attorney William Pepper thinks the state is afraid of Brown's fact-finding mission.
Because I think he's independent and he's determined to get to the truth no matter where it leads.
But Shelby County District Attorney Bill Gibbons says the state already knows the truth, that King's killer is sitting in prison.
It is in the interest of the public, in the interest of Dr. King's legacy, that he remain in prison, and we're going to do everything we can to make sure that's where he stays.
And that, says the son of the late civil rights leader, is an obstruction of justice. Dexter King was front and center at today's hearing.
And we are here to say that we support this process, we support this judge, we support truth and justice.
The 3-judge panel suggested Ray's attorneys are grasping at straws. In order for the state to be obligated to reopen the case, they said, the defense needs to provide proof, and soon.
That evidence, when Ray comes into court, must conclusively establish his actual innocence. That's what we're talking about here. And that doesn't mean an affidavit from a carnival worker at the Mid-South Fair.
Pepper's response?
In my own view, Your Honor, The state of Tennessee will be through with this case when James Earl Ray is given a trial.
In Jackson, Tennessee, Joyce Peterson, Action News 5.
James Earl Ray was transferred to this Nashville hospital from prison on Saturday. Sources say he's suffering from cirrhosis of the liver and reportedly is near death. Ray will forever be known as the man who killed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The famed civil rights leader was gunned down at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis in April 1968. Ray admitted to the crime and was sentenced to life in prison, but later changed his story and said he didn't do it. Several years ago, he wrote a book called Who Killed Martin Luther King Jr., and in it claimed King's death was part of a conspiracy by the federal government, and he was just the fall guy.
Yeah, people set it up. I think they want some type of a, what they call a dumb white dude to, take the rap for it.
Ray escaped from prison for a short time in 1977 and tried to escape again in 1991. 3 years ago, HBO filmed a mock trial of Ray's case, and he himself testified, hoping to clear his name. The mock jury found Ray not guilty. But in the real world, the parole board denied his request 2 years ago, saying they still considered him a dangerous man. Hospital and state prison officials will only confirm that James Earl Ray is here, but they refuse to comment on his condition because of security reasons, they say, and because his case is so high profile.
What can you tell us about your brother's passing?
He just died of kidney failure due to the liver problems. And he died peacefully. There was no, the government or the politician can't torture him no longer.
I'm sorry?
I said the government or the politician can't torture him no longer. He's at peace now.
Was this a decision the family made to discontinue life support or anything like that?
It wasn't made until today, and until I seen, there's no way he could come out of this one. He would only live 2 or 3 more days without it. And why put him through any more torture?
So his passing came after he was removed?
Yeah, after everything is removed. He lived for about a half an hour afterwards.
What time was the life support connected?
I forget the time of death, but about a half an hour before the time of death.
Time of death was 10:36.
Well, at about 10 o'clock, around 10 o'clock.
Did you have anything final to say to him?
No, I couldn't talk to him because he's been in a coma for the last couple of days. And last time I talked to him was Friday. I've talked to him on the phone since then. He can call it out of prison, but I haven't talked to him personally since Friday.
What was your last conversation with him like? Anything about his fate?
Well, our main conversation Friday was he had in for a clemency thing where they let him out to die outside. And Ben's Sunquist has never taken no one way or the other against him or for him. He thought he'd have a chance, even though last year when we put him for furlough, Campbell turned him down, and we know who the boss of Campbell is. So as I said before, we just got a gutless SOB as a governor.
We are saddened of the death of Mr. James Earl Ray. And the tragedy is that many of us feel that James Earl Ray did not have his day in court. And so we certainly send out our condolences to the Ray family. But also, I must say that we are not deterred because we certainly feel that justice and the truth still has not been told. It is certainly our hope that through the Attorney General's office and through other investigators that the 4 or 5 questions that were raised specifically by former Ambassador and Mayor Andrew Young, as well as by the chairperson of the House Subcommittee investigation on the deaths of the Kennedy and King deaths, former Congressman Walter Fauntleroy, and also the concerns of my mother, Coretta Scott King, will be addressed. And at this time, although Mr. Ray is deceased, we do still believe that there's enough information. If a thorough job is done, we can only hope and pray that the truth one day emerges. That is the extent of what I will say at this time, and if there are questions, I think we have just a few moments for questions. With an apparatus.
Lisa Martin III is still giving his news conference. Let's just go there live and listen into some of his comments.
Victims. You know, I don't think anyone has a right to say to me, you don't have a right to find out who killed your father. People forget that he was our father and my mother's husband. And so for anyone to criticize someone who is in seek of truth and justice, I think that is not correct. But again, the major point for us is not to prosecute. In fact, now that James Earl Ray is dead, there are still some people at large. But our objective was never to prosecute. Our objective was to kind of acquire the truth, because our nation must go through a cleansing process. I think we become a better nation. That's really what Martin Luther King Jr. challenged us to do as a nation. Before we can ever resolve a problem, we have to accept that a problem exists. I mean, we have to accept that we are a violent nation. In Jonesboro, Arkansas, the other day, what's wrong with our children? Our children are products of our environment. And until we accept there's something wrong with our nation, we've got to address. Then we can never address the problem. So what we're saying is, until we accept the fact that there were some individuals, not our whole government, not our entire country, but there were some individuals who did not understand Martin Luther King Jr., who felt that he needed to be removed. And they put a plan in action to do it. And unfortunately, some of those happen to be people who were in our government. And if it was not government and military intervention, I would venture to say that if, for example, if we could just say it was just the mob, I believe that they would have pinned it just on the mob and it would have been a closed story. But the fact is, it was not just the mob. The mob was one of those elements. And actually, that is all that I have to say today. Thank you very much.
This overcast, rainy day grew colder after King Center visitors heard the news James Earl Ray was dead. Coretta Scott King sent out a statement on behalf of the King family. This is a tragedy, not only for Mr. Ray and his family, but also for the entire nation. America will never have the benefit of Mr. Ray's trial, which would have produced new revelations about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., as well as established the facts concerning Mr. Ray's innocence. It was just weeks ago the King family asked President Clinton to reopen the assassination investigation. Civil rights activist Jesse Jackson agrees with the family. James Earl Ray was a pawn in a bigger conspiracy.
But I am convinced that James Earl Ray, in fact, did kill Dr. King, but did not act alone.
Mrs. King, speaking for the family, said, "We are more determined than ever to find the truth about this tragedy, which has had such a profound impact on our society. It is regrettable that Mr. Ray was denied his day in court, but the American people have a right to the truth about this tragedy, and we intend to do everything we can to bring it to light." Ray died at 10:37 this morning, 30 minutes after his life support was disconnected. He died of kidney failure. At the King Center, school children just yesterday visited the Lorraine Motel, where the civil rights leader was shot down.
I think it's sad to say that he died, because I really did want to know the truth.
There was no physical body to remember, only ashes. And today, Jerry Ray carried them into a service he said would have pleased his brother.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. May James Earl Ray be clothed with glory. And we gather to celebrate the life of James Earl Ray, to remember the life that he lived, and to hold it before us today as one utterly unique and significant human life.
The church was packed, and the majority of mourners were African American. Most believe Ray was the fall guy in the King assassination, not the killer. Dr. King's nephew drove up from Atlanta to deliver this message from his family.
On this occasion, we renew our determination for a full investigation to seek out the truth about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Jerry Ray says his brother would be happy to know he drew such a crowd. Like the Kings, he will continue his brother's fight.
His main thing for 30 years, he didn't talk so much about getting out of prison, but about clearing his name. That was his main thing, to clear his name.
William Pepper, the man who tried for a decade to get Ray a trial, flew in from London for the service. Pepper says he believes Dr. King's spirit has been with them.
And I believe his spirit is here with us today. I think his legacy for a better world survives. Barely, but it survives.
And with it, questions that may never be answered.
James Earl Ray will be remembered as an assassin, as the man who silenced one of the great voices of freedom.
Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee.
Ray confessed to gunning down Martin Luther King Jr. at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis in 1968. But a few days after he was sentenced to 99 years in prison, Ray recanted. He tried to convince the world the FBI killed Dr. King, and he was set up as the fall guy.
The people set it up. I think they want some type of a, what they call a dumb white dude to, take the rap for it.
During his nearly 30 years in prison, Ray escaped and was recaptured. He was married and divorced. He survived a knife attack by other inmates. He was a central character in one of the defining tragedies of the 1960s, but in prison, he was just another con.
I think everyone knows who he is and what he's there for, but they tend to accept him just as another inmate.
To the public, he was an enigma, fame fueled by conspiracy theories. Finally, with his health failing, Ray found reason for hope. Members of Dr. King's family broke their 29-year silence, asking a Memphis judge to grant him a jury trial as the only way to find the truth. A few months later, a dramatic televised meeting with Dexter King, the first time a member of the King family met Ray face to face.
Did you kill my father?
No, I didn't, no. I had nothing to do with shooting your father.
I believe you, and my family believes you.
Although he convinced the Kings he was innocent, time simply ran out. At age 68, James Earl Ray died of liver failure in a Nashville hospital. If he knew some secret about the King assassination, he didn't tell it. So the conspiracy theories will linger. But without proof, history will record James Earl Ray as the killer of a great leader. And history isn't very forgiving. Dan McDonald, News Channel 5.
Greeting Cyril Wecht at the Nashville airport was Jerry Ray. He's hoping Wecht can prove his brother was the innocent victim of a conspiracy that may have included the federal government.
We want to find out how he got hepatitis, if it's from the blood transfusion or if it's if they injected him with something, see, because...
Do you think that your brother was purposely injected with hepatitis?
It's a possibility.
Dr. Wecht doesn't believe anything he finds under the microscope will answer the question of who shot Dr. Martin Luther King 30 years ago in Memphis. He does find that circumstances surrounding Ray's disease and death may prove something. But if you find that he was infected with hepatitis purposefully, do you think that that lends weight to the theory that there was a conspiracy?
Oh, if that were ultimately to be determined, while it would not be direct evidence, it certainly would create some very, very strong implications, would it not?
The autopsy took 2 hours to perform. At the end of it, Dr. Wecht confirmed the cause of death was liver failure.
Nothing unusual. The exact kind of hepatitis and exactly when and how he contracted that disease, all of that remains yet to be seen.
Tonight I'm not worried about anything.
It's been 30 years. James Earl Ray, the man convicted of King's assassination, is dead. But today that closed case is open, if only in a limited way. Janet Reno's Justice Department will only look into allegations by a former FBI agent and a Memphis bar owner. The two claim there was evidence that Ray did not act alone.
At a first impression, I think that there is some corroboration for the claims that have been made. I just don't know whether that is going to hold up upon closer scrutiny.
King was killed in Memphis in 1968. Ray confessed to the crime but later recanted. Ray claimed he was set up by a shadowy gunman named Raoul.
I have always believed that there was a Raoul, that James Earl Ray did not make up that account. Such a person is necessary to explain his financing and to explain his movements and to explain his connection to the crime.
King's family also believes Ray did not act alone. They pressured Reno to open a full-scale investigation with an independent counsel with subpoena power, but the Attorney General refused. Civil rights leaders criticized any limited investigation.
You either turn the resources of the federal government loose on this murder or you forget about it, one of the two. I don't think you ought to toy with it.
But the question is, after 30 years, will the trail be too cold, and will witnesses' memories be sharp enough to revive the case? In Washington, Pat Rogers reporting. In Washington, Pat Rogers, KCAL 9 News.
Good morning, Mrs. King.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here. We realize how stressful it is at times, particularly because of the gauntlet of media out there. But we're grateful for your presence. Could you just tell us, by way of background, what was the purpose of Dr. King's visit to Memphis, his involvement in Memphis, and his coming here in 1968?
Martin came to Memphis to support the sanitation workers who were engaged in a strike for better wages and working conditions, and he felt it was important to come to support them because they were working poor people.
Right. And how did the sanitation workers strike and his support for that fit into the Poor People's March in Washington, which had been planned for later on that spring?
He felt that it was important that he give his support to them because they were a part of what he was really struggling to get the nation to understand, that people work full-time jobs, but in a sense part-time pay. And even people who were poor worked, could not make a decent living, and so they would then be invited to join the mobilization for the, absolutely, he felt that, as you know, his whole life was dedicated to nonviolent struggle, and anytime there was violence of any kind, it was very disturbing to him, and he disavowed it completely, and whenever he had an opportunity to, and he dedicated his life to helping people to understand the philosophy of nonviolence, which he lived it as a way of life, and so when he came to Memphis, I don't know, counsel, should I mention that I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when he came to Memphis the first time, and there was a march that he led, which his organization had very little to do with planning, that broke out in violence. It was very, very upsetting to him, because most of the marches, and I would say all of them that he had led, had always been mobilized with the support of the National Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff, and therefore they were aware of any problems, any controversies that might exist, conflicts between groups and among groups. But he came that day from a trip, got off the plane and went straight to the head of the march, and of course the march did break out in violence, and it was most disturbing to him. So when when this happened, he felt that it was very important for him to return to Memphis to lead a peaceful, nonviolent march before he could go forth to Washington. He had to demonstrate that a nonviolent march, a peaceful march, could take place in Memphis because of the, of course, the criticisms that were being leveled at that time.
So he returned to Memphis that last time because of the violence that broke out on the March 28th. And he was determined, from what you're saying, to restore the position of nonviolence to the movement.
Yes, that's correct.
Did he attribute did he have any idea as to why that march on March 28th turned violent? Did he have any notion of what caused that?
Well, I think he became aware that there was a local, well, he thought at that time it was a local group of young people who really precipitated the violence, and the feeling was that there were some forces behind them, that they were not just persons who decided that they would throw rocks and break windows.
Now,
a legal remedy available for us. We exercised it, and we were victorious.
Dexter King, his mother, Coretta Scott King, and other King family members filed a wrongful death lawsuit against retired businessman Lloyd Jowers. It was Jowers who claimed 6 years ago that he paid someone other than James Earl Ray to pull the trigger, firing the fatal bullet that snuffed out the life of the civil rights leader. That was in 1968 in Memphis. Today, a Memphis jury found that Martin Luther King Jr. was the victim of a vast murder conspiracy, not a lone assassin. Among those named for their involvement in the conspiracy:
Frank Liberto, United States government, Memphis Police Department, State of Tennessee, and Earl Clark.
Their percentages about $100?
And James Earl Ray.
James Earl Ray confessed to killing Dr. King and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He soon recanted and spent the remainder of his life claiming his innocence, trying to get a trial. He died last year of liver disease, still in prison. As for Lloyd Jowers, he's never named King's assassin. He did not testify at the trial. Jowers let stand earlier admissions that he was paid a large sum of money to participate in the conspiracy. In the suit, the King family asked for a minimal amount in damages. They were awarded $100. The Kings say it was never about the money. They wanted evidence of a conspiracy to lend support to their call for a new investigation into the assassination. The jury's verdict delivered the payoff they wanted.
I think we can move on with our lives and know that, you know, we did all we could. I think my dad would be proud that we really sought, you know, the truth and justice. Everything he talked about and everything he stood for, I think, is represented here.
Kids finish the last tour of the night, linger in the room, stare at the spot where he fell. The Lorraine Motel is now a museum. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King is still real.
But all for one purpose, which is really to figure out where we go from here.
At a town hall meeting on the other side of Memphis, scholars discussed the reality and King's dream. But conspiracy theories could overshadow 30 years of progress, something George Sellers says should not be forgotten.
We have to be very careful not to let the message die with the messenger.
Sellers is one of dozens ending a 3-month march from Atlanta. As they arrived, Andrew Young held a press conference back home, talking about Lloyd Jowers, who owned a grill across the street, who claims 5 men conspired in his grill, gave him money to give to a gunman, gave him a smoking rifle that same fatal day.
Obviously, when people don't want to know the truth, they have something to hide or something to fear. We'll never be free from suspicion, mistrust, until we know the truth.
Reverend Joseph Lowry says the 70-year-old Jowers should be given immunity to tell his story. So does James Orange, who wrestled with Andy Young near 2 caddies as they waited to go to dinner with their mentor.
Within 2 minutes after the shooting, this lot was full of police officers. And the National Guard basically showed up following that. So somebody knew something to be here that quick. And in the morning after the shooting, all of these bushes was cleaned off. The next morning, somebody is hiding something in reference to this conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy.
We share more in common than we do.
It's something this town hall meeting did not discuss, only King's accomplishments, something George Sellers says should be remembered, even 30 years later.
But I do believe that there must be truth, and in Dr. King's own words, truth crushed to earth shall rise again.